They say one of the hallmarks of like human intelligence over computational or artificial intelligence, I guess, is that humans are able to spot when something isn't, like intrinsically know that there's like what you're looking for is not on the list.
Mhm.
That the absence of something keeps the human brain like occupied until it figures out why the thing is absent, even if it doesn't have a name.
Right.
And I think about that with regards to uh said demon.
Yeah.
Like ponderous in his absence, pendulous in his absence. But
Yeah, it makes me think of the grasp of the mastery or an approach to mastery, also having that quality of knowing what's not there. It's one of the things people say a lot about, like Mendelev's periodic table, right? Is that he not all of the things that are on the what we now call a complete periodic table were known to him at the time, especially the kind of artificial ones that they make by, breaking down bits of matter and stuff. But he knew that they would be there, that he left space for the things that he was like, something should occupy this space that doesn't yet.
the when I was a freshman, our design teacher, we had to do a design project like centered around the physical environment of where the studio was. So like Playwrights Horizons was right by Astor Place.
Mm-hmm.
And so like some people did reports on various things, like the Alamo, which is the big spinning cube, or the Hebrew Internationally Aid Society, which is now the Public Theater, or was the Vauxhall Gardens. Anyway, in addition to all those wonderful things that were fascinating, I learned about Cooper Union and how Mr. Cooper knew that elevators were going to be a thing, so he left a space in the building for an elevator. And so when elevators were invented, it was easy to put one in, but he left a giant circular space, so it's a circular elevator, which is kind of cool. Uh, but thinking of like, there's going to be an automated staircase or something, so
Yeah.
let's leave a chamber here for when that happens, which is,
Yeah.
like it's not quite the weird three demons of absence that are in, I will inquire you about to you about for you something. Anyway, hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of Radio Free Golgotha. Uh,
Hiya.
this is our late June episode. I have no idea. Well, no, I do have an idea of who we're talking about, but I have no idea if we will ever approach the beginning of the months again without great planning. Uh, so to that, I say happy Feast of Saint Irenaeus and the anti-Gnostic, the against heresy, the ever unheretical Saint Irenaeus. And so yes, so happy Feast of Saint Irenaeus and hello Al.
Hello.
We have a wonderful Googleplex of I don't know why sex toys came to mind. That's bizarre. Of a box of goodies. Here we go. Let's sesame street these babies out. Woo! Okay, where's the brain? So the saint of the day is Saint Irenaeus. The
Mhm.
demon is Tharithimas, which sounds like I'm lisping on purpose, but it is not our Saint Cyprian episode. Tharithimas, Tharithimas, the unknown, and
Mm.
a little bit, talking a little bit about the corresponding Exu Kaminaloa from Quimbanda. The plant of the day is the humble but powerful hazel. Um, the stone is, or mineral in this case, mercury, quicksilver. The magic is gnosis. The geomantic figure is Karker, a little bit of a nod to its corresponding Odu of Ifa and Dilogun of Odi. The tarot trump is the world, or arcanum, I guess we can say, instead of giving power to the other word. Uh, and the dead magician is a favorite of mine who I've mentioned a few times on the show, and I'm doing a presentation that involves him as well very soon, but Charabel. Uh,
Mhm.
and
Mr. John Thomas.
yes, a proper Welshman. Uh,
Right?
but yeah, so yay, hot June weather. And plants are booming and mosquitoes are booming and plenty of gnosis to go around. Um, uh,
Such knowledge, such awareness. Very wow.
Yes, exactly. Um, and yeah, so this is my art. Well, there was an easier segue in. Now I don't know how to segue back to the saint other than, hi, Saint Irenaeus, how are you?
How's he doing? Well, he died today, that many years ago, around 202 at Common Era. So, we don't know a lot about his death, I believe. So hopefully, peacefully in his sleep. One can but hope. But what a legacy he leaves that we get to talk about now.
Yeah, we don't actually know much about his death, including the even the day. It's honored today probably to fill in a vacuum of or a dearth of proper feasts.
Mm.
But he's regarded as a martyr, as most early Christians are. And during this time, I'm surprised it's not another Diocletian. But this is a historical personage who is remembered for writing specifically against heresy, and in this case, most notably Valentinian Gnosticism. So he's a Greek bishop and is from Smyrna in Asia Minor, in what is now Turkey. So this is the first half of the second century. It's somewhere in there, 120 and 140. He was brought up in a Christian family. He did not convert as an adult, so he is not a mudblood Christian. He's true. It was actually the discussion, or this is actually Marcus Aurelius as opposed to Diocletian, which is fascinating because Aurelius is his own kind of dead magician we could talk about sometime. But he's appointed as the priest of the Church of Lyon, or Lion if you're really, really American. Uh, and many were being imprisoned because of Marcus Aurelius. And there was this heresy that the Pope was trying to figure out what the problem, how to attack it, which is Montanism, and is a second century, wonderful Gnostic, is Montanism? Yeah, heresy, which was popping up every so often, right? Like there's just new heresies abound because the church is so young. And oh, someone had a different thought. Well, that is not okay. Basically the main thing is it's pretty much similar to the standard Christian church at the time, but it allowed for new prophets. And that was the main reason it needed to be stopped, because people could have new insights. So, you were allowed to have a personal gnosis that would then change everything about something that had, whether it was the implications of inclusion of foreigners into Christianity, or to what rites had to be done, or adding scripture to existing scripture.
Right, or any of the especially later emphases on like the secret teachings of Christ, or
Yeah,
like
how can you direct everything through? And I mean, it's easily manipulatable, of course, as far as church heresies go, but it was seen as an important thing to stamp out very quickly. So this is, he starts writing against these things. His pen is his weapon. And was it Marcus the Magician that was next, or where he goes later on? But certainly there are Gnostic enclaves near Lyon, and followers of Marcus the Magician. Many Gnostics popping up all over the Rhone Valley, which is its own lovely. I want to know what these different groups were prophesying here, and it reminds me of future prophetesses that pop up, a millennia later, before the invention of witchcraft, but still write well in the kind of Montanist, like new prophecies can pop up at any time. And so with it makes me think about what you talked about too, with like the conflation of outer and inner vision in worldview. And if you were to think upon Jesus strongly, and Jesus starts talking to you in your head, that this is treated as if it was an external vision. There's no difference. There's no differentiation. It's not a hallucination. It is, you have thought, which adds to like the Catholic premise of like sin in thought is sin indeed. Right. That to fantasize, to daydream about having sex with, whoever, a nun, or anybody previous to marriage is in fact having sex with a nun, or anybody previous to marriage. I don't know why I keep saying nun here, but I'm trying to think of something that's shocking that like you are not actually doing, but you're like sitting there in mass undressing the priest with your eyes. Right. This is indeed lust. And
the notion that the to the soul all image of the image making faculties of the imagination is real in some sense. That it leaves a stain or influence or affect. Yeah.
Almost like even the engagement in it once makes it easier to do in the future. and
Habituation, right?
yeah, there's this concupiscence that happens of like turning towards the dark more easily because of the gateway drug of daydreaming. Um,
Yeah.
so boredom causes worlds to crumble, apparently.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he's yeah, like you said, like it's and something I think we can get into with Gnosis as well as now is like the idea of a single Gnosticism is unhelpful, right? There are Gnosticisms. It looks like the very term Gnosticism is a 17th century, at least in the English, is 17th century English. It seems that the people that coined Gnostic as proponents or extremists of this thing are themselves critics like Irenaeus. And I don't know how much that's like, the Impressionists, where they were like, oh, that's what our enemies are calling us. Cool. That's what we'll be.
The Gardnerians of
Yeah.
about so like it's interesting because it brings up a few things which overlaps with Gnosticism, I guess, in that way that all right, so he outlines what's going on, right? So especially in Adversus Heresis, talking about the Valentinian Gnostics and their predecessors, who the church does tend to conflate heresies and Gnosticism as like consistent schools of thought that are popping up over and over again.
Right, like the atomists. Yeah. Someone's always getting naked and saying that we should be naked again. Yeah.
Yeah, and even if it's not the case of a continual like lineage, there is still this kind of like the same thing before of like the fact that one has happened will make it easier for another to happen as things go along. So like he lays out the history of the Valentinian Gnostics, and going back to Simon Magus, who's not actually that long ago when he's writing, and then attempts to provide evidence that Valentinianism has no merit whatsoever. Like he's just debunking it, trying to show how foolish it is, and then shows not only is it foolish that it has no merit, but that the Gospels themselves will show you that they're completely false. Like this doesn't make sense. So there's a lot of relying upon scriptural reference to convince the reader of the error of Gnosticism in general, but especially Valentinianism.
Yeah, and it's worth foregrounding that while people have been quoting scripture since there's been scripture, this, sure, we can call it centralizing a church authority, because it is, but it seems Irenaeus is certainly credited with contributing to this orthodoxy or this proto-orthodoxy, not just in terms of scripture, but in terms of the tradition handed down from the apostles of the importance of the Gospels and the centrality of them in defining faithful and impious practice, right? And also, crucially, the teachings of the apostles' successors, which is also, like, I don't know, very interesting in terms of how Irenaeus cites his own spiritual authority, or not authority, but like expertise at least, right? He's said to have seen and been witness to the preaching of the previous bishop of Smyrna, Polycarpus, who said, at least by Irenaeus, and I think by Tertullian as well, to have heard John the Evangelist, and thus kind of represents, or is later represented as, one of these like final connections, eyewitness connections with the apostles themselves.
Yeah, I guess what interests me specifically about what having to prove with his writings against Valentinianism, which is like the primary heresies, right? Of that there's like there are only three types of people in the world: the people that are going to be saved, the people that are going to have like another alternative of it, and people that are just going to go away. As far as like spiritual, psychic, and claiborne, borrowing the witchcraft term, but just purely physical people, which is fascinating. The idea that, I mean, there's a complex cosmology that is inherent in Valentinianism, but like that's a whole other wormhole. Right? I mean, this is the Ogdoad, this is Sophia, this is the heavenly Christ that descends into the worldly Christ, the worldly Jesus at the baptism of Jesus by John. So this is we have evidence and this cosmology because of the students of Valentinianism, not necessarily Mr. Valentine himself, Valentinus. But there's so much outspoken against this, and there's a beautiful cosmology that is obviously inheriting and moving through things and trying to synthesize. Just wrap the head around how do you connect. I feel like half the early Gnosticism are just how do you connect the dots between all of the things you're exposed to and feel are true in the Eastern Mediterranean at the time. And it's like flashes of insight that are there, which kind of becomes synonymous with Gnostic insight in general, and gets more developed, of course, as time goes on, because as you're pointing out, like the concept is still an overly romanticized Mandela effect. Like it's really hard to know what ancient people actually thought about some of these things. We do have textual reference, but what we do know is the reaction against them by the church, and what is the church trying to control in this case. I do find it interesting that he spends the last part of his Against Heresies talking about Paul, or at least quoting the Gospels and talking about Paul, because Paul, I think, as we mentioned, is kind of a weird version of Gnosticism within the Orthodox Church, because Paul never met Jesus. Paul only saw a spiritual vision of Jesus and did not know the scriptures and the text. He's talking to a ghost, something. So it's interesting that he emphasizes the spirit of Christ over the historical Christ at all times, because the historical Christ does not matter to him. So Christ is only an energy. Christ is only the heavenly Christ to Paul. And that's a whole other sort of righteousness to come in that I find peculiar with everything. I think as far as Irenaeus, one should not seek among others the truth that can be easily gotten from the church. And it reminded me of, I think I sent you that meme about orthodoxy. And I think you may have even brought it up on an episode already, but the idea that the oral traditions around early Christianity are preserved within their various denominations, but the Gospels themselves weren't written for quite some time, written down. And so oral tradition is how the churches were built. Orality and what that means, that textual transmission can still be a part of orality, can still arise out of orality, and the interactions, not just through oral transmission, but the whole culture of a sacred scripture, what it means to have those scriptures outline certain thoughts. What does it mean when people start diverging from your particular interpretation of those thoughts? And how do you keep it in control? And why do you need to keep it in control? Like, what's the harm in people having different thoughts about the words of Christ and these different gospels that pop up, whether it's the standard teachings or this, if you give me a few more dollars, I'll give you the real shit, which would be in the modern marketplace, I suppose.
Well, it's interesting. He's banging on about like Greek merchants, right? Like, and one of the things he sees as harmful is the idea of teaching that the world is a creation of an evil god, right? Or even an accidental creation. That he seems to be against this concept of of world hating Gnosticism. And we also see that there's this distinction between saying that we're not trying to escape the world, we're trying to be, arguing that like the real good gnosis is the knowledge of Christ, right, which doesn't help us escape from this horrible place that we're trapped in, but rather redeems us from ourselves.
Well, it's as you point out, even with like the plurality of Gnosticism, or the plurality of any practice in many ways often shows that it's a thriving actual thing, as opposed to a revisionist. And it's worth pointing out, like Pagels, definitely Elaine Pagels, who's specialist in non-commodity things and alternative gospels and things like that. She goes after Irenaeus for even something so simple as like sexual
libertinism. Classic church thing. They're over there being perverts, right?
They're consuming semen and shit and menses and all these other things, which like good for you. But that she was like, we find more evidence to the contrary, that they're like, no more capturing souls in this world. But also important to point out that like previous to 1945, Irenaeus is the source of our knowledge of Gnosticism.
Yes.
Even those 19th century revivals of the term Gnostic, and occult revivalists of the 19th and 20th century until 1945 only have the over-romanticization of Irenaeus's words on Gnosticism for the most part. That means that our entire, for like the majority of our understanding of Gnosticism comes from this one saint. And
who didn't like it.
And it becomes like a discovery of witchcraft of like, definitely don't do these things.
Right.
Don't believe that there are multiple types of people in the world, that some can be saved and some can't. That's terrible, based on predestination in this way, and like that Jesus was possessed by the Spirit of Christ. And like this is all very bad. So you're like telling people the exact alternate thoughts that they could have of like, well, I never thought about it that way. That's quite interesting.
Well, I wasn't gonna until you told me not to.
Exactly. Exactly. I mean, the power of suggestion through the miracle of gnosis, which tastes like chocolate, and stings like mercury. But So, you know, Hippolytus, Tertullian expand on there, and everybody's extrapolating and kind of make Gnostics, you know, the not just unappealing, at least in the historical record, but dangerous and perhaps even to the point like there is discussion by the time we get and relevant to like witchcraft things, you know, with Julia from Occulta always going off in wonderful, detailed ways that I am so happy that she does about the witchcraft laws in Spain, being the creation of modern concepts of witchcraft not as a political crime and therefore as perversions of Christianity, as opposed to just survivals of paganism that were they were called what they were, paganism, not
Right.
witchcraft, not these other things. So the conception of like modern ideas that witchcraft is a survival of pagan or foreign thoughts and different cults and things like that, and often including heretical versions of Christianity, like this. You know, you buy the big book of pagan rituals, and it's all Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. But in this case specifically, with the creation of the witchcraft laws, which are you know designed to kind of steal property or to bring into question the ownership of property by Jews and Cathars, and
Right.
there are many scholars that doubt the existence of a unified Cathar belief and that it's all child of propaganda from the
Yeah.
church, like that there might have been small sects believing certain things, but again, when all you have is who is against them and who is trying to take them out, and we know that they had money that they were storing in the Pyrenees, it becomes this thing of like, what is the truth? You don't know, and so
Yeah.
it's kind of inheritor to the Irenaeus, like let's call this out, and then people only reading that and saying like, okay, great, how do I play into this? How do I explore this? You know,
Mhm.
it's in addition from going to you know the Ogdoad into the Nous and Aletheia and Logos and Zoe and the you know Anthropos and Ecclesia going to the Decad and the Dodecad and all these other things that are specifically to the Aeonic cosmology of Valentinianism. You know, it's like people obsess over Cainite Gnosticism or Ophite Gnosticism, and all we know is that somebody may have had some snakes there, or or had Cain as a redeeming figure, and it you know it brings to mind like even the persecution of the Yesidi and the description of like you have to have a book or you'll be persecuted, so they make the Mishafresh, and there's their own versions and of like heretical takes upon early Islamic lore, but it's not quite that. And how much of that is trying to present something to the outside world so that you can still preserve what you have within your own group, but then
Yeah.
that becomes recycled and brought back in and is taught and fed back to your own future generations as this is what our ancestors believed, which I guess ties it all into curiously both our discussion of where we have to go with the demon and a little bit with Gnosis. So I guess to finish up Irenaeus is like good job setting this up as far as like you gave us Gnosticism for a very long time. And if your notes weren't good, you did a really good job like mix it. Like this is the type of thing of we see this online with mimetics and how this works, that people will be like they create a false problem to illustrate something they want to talk about.
Yeah.
And like, is that really happening? Did like 20 people send you a letter complaining about this one product you make? I don't know if that's true
Hmm.
based on the post of like,
Mhm.
it's going like, people always tell me that I don't know what I'm doing with this specific formula. And you're
Right.
like, that's not how people speak. But
Mhm. Mhm.
you did a really good, you know, Irenaean job here. Like Vito's always on about Morissettian irony, that like there's no irony in ironic. And so it's irony in name. The real irony is that the song is about irony and there's no irony. And I
Yes.
wonder sometimes, you know, hear the the Irenaean kind of complaint of like how much Gnosticism is there in this anti-Gnosticism? You know, how much Gnosis are you receiving about the Gnostics in order to be anti-Gnostic anyway?
Yeah. Yeah. Is it the yes, the Streisand effect, right? Whereby attempts to, censor information just make people want to know more about it.
I don't know that as a what's why is it the Streisand effect?
Oh, it's from Barbara Streisand. It was her attorney's attempts to stop a photograph. I remember very vaguely, and in the suit that they filed got made public, and suddenly everyone wanted to see her magnificent clifftop residence in Malibu. She didn't want pictures of her house getting out, and that made everyone want to see it more.
Yeah, which is like there's some great marketing strategy in that, right? Too, like you can spin that the way that you need to of like,
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. I've got a secret. Is and for the low price of your soul, or $9.99 a month, then you too can have the true secret. I couldn't possibly talk about it in a public forum, except
yes,
that
yeah,
you
yeah,
are,
yeah.
except that you are.
Or all even the little techniques that are used in public speaking, that like those are things that we're also taught, is to like always have more information and more footnotes than and everything else. Like, no, I do want to talk about these things, but I really am only given 19 minutes.
Bury the lead. Yeah, it was burying
Yeah.
the lead. Yes, yes, that was absolute advice I was given. Was like, if you have more material that you want to talk about, make a statement that you can back up, but don't bother providing any evidence for it. When someone's like, "You say this, but like, why do you think that?" You can be like, "Well," and you can go into the second appendix of your slides.
Yeah. I have
Yeah.
20 slides for the first 20 minutes, and for the Q&A, I have 50 more. Yeah, there's something I don't know, it's stirring to mind a few things. It was I don't know why it's related in my head, but I was reading about like differences between American and British spelling
Mm.
is supposedly partially due to newspapers
Mhm.
and trying to fit
Telegrams, right?
words
Hmm.
right in the headlines.
Yeah, yeah.
Just,
Cents per letter and stuff as
yeah,
well.
and so dropping double L's or changing OU to O. And I was like, that's fascinating. Like just a similarity of how print then manifests and changes cultures and how it moves forward in that way. So I guess on that note, which is probably not a bad segue, as far as how print changes cultures, is I suggested a demon for this episode of Tharithimas based upon Eluzio Fontanelle's syncretization that we've talked about before on the show in his book Exu, which is where we see in print for the first time a correspondence between Grimoire and Verum demons, mostly, and the Exus of Quimbanda as popularized in the 50s and 60s in Brazil. And, we've talked about Quimbanda many times, but Quimbanda at this point is going through a very kind of interesting validation process by comparing what was originally very, very African magic to using it to describe black magic in general across the spectrum of everything from like, yes, the African folk magic that had survived and continued to mature in its own ways within various enclaves and various ethnic groups, especially in places like Bahia, Rio de Janeiro, and Espiritu Santo, and and those enclaves of places where strong ethnic groups had their own practices that were going and being influenced by others, but also through the validation in print of how to sell books, how to sell sensational little penny grimoires, which you see in Mexican candle stores as well, where there's like 40 different versions of the Heptameron that only have like one line changed, and they're all something different, and are often called the Book of Saint Cyprian or the Treasure of Spirits or things like this. In this case, he gives Fontanelle compares European demon lists and with the aid of a hyphen, gives over to a list of issues. And the creation of these issues, it's helpful, I think, different Kimbandas, different Umbandas, different Candomblés, different Cachimbo groups may have had and used many of these names, but they were less standardized. And so the names are what becomes popular. And a lot of this, we don't know. We know that Kaminaloa has a history both in the Orisha Candomblés as well as a spirit that can be worked with, and it's tied to like the Mosuromin Kimbanda lineage. But like here it becomes popularly blanketed, and you have the difference of Kimbanda being that it is under the aegis of the big three, meaning Lucifer, Ashtaroth, and Beelzebub, as opposed to the laws of Umbanda, which are a pseudo-spiritist revision of African Orisha or some other spiritist principle, whether it's towards the light. Here it's claiming to be the darkest of the dark and be under the guidance of these three kings, and then the lists pan out accordingly. That there's as you have called them, the deputies, the six that are under the capeta in Quimana of Lucifer, Moore, and Redes Cruciadas. But in Fontanelle's original book, page 109, Organograma das Falanges do Povo do Exu, Lucifer, the mayoral, the highest, with his six, with the deputies there, but then like Exu Moore is like literally under, as Beelzebub is kind of under Put Satanica in the chart. It's a very misleading chart.
Mm.
It's confusing. and that Ashtaroth is under a Gallireps there. But this is the big three and the deputies that are six, then filtering down to Sirach, who is Eshu Kalunga or Nomo, and a certain number of Eshus there, including Klepoth as number 300 there, who is viewed as all Pumbajiras, and then it filtering again through Omulu, who is not on the list, is not syncretized at all. And it's interesting that he doesn't even try to syncretize it because Omulu is a god. It's the kind of the Jeji manifestation of the Babalueye complex and is so well known in Brazil as sickness and death in various manifestations. But under Omulu, you have Sergalat and Hail. And that part, that there's these continued lists. And where I'm curious, and where we've talked about this briefly, but like the ones under Sergalat that are listed, Procolo, Harstum, Brulifor, Pentagony, Sidroglosum, Minusum, and Bucons, and then having a glasses, I'm pronouncing these terribly, but Eshodoshedo, kind of the hanging chad of the group there. Those are all accountable within Grimoire and Verum as you know it, but the ones under Hail, there are a few, like Haramel, and then the first, like Sergo Tirsmael, Sestugriel, and Elegoap. But then there's these other three that are not part of any Grimoire and Verum that you are familiar with. No. And yet, we don't know where are these names from? Damaston, Tharithimas, and Nelbiroth. So I put that intro of I can talk the Quimbanda side of why I thought it could be fun to do one that was we just did one with Ganga, and we don't know much about Damaston. Yeah. Apparently, we know even less about Tharithimas. Yes. Yeah. So I turn it over to you in fascination, and I hope I didn't spill the only point that we were able to find out, which is that there's three demons that we don't know anything about on this list.
No, that's a great setup. Yeah. There are a couple points where whatever manuscript or manuscripts that Fontanelle is working off differ, and then there's how he arranges them as well. So to overview, if we look at an earlier grimoire in the Verum family, and of which there are many different manuscripts as well, and many different formulations of them. But if we're to go by Clibicula Solomonis de Secretis, that gives us the 8 Procolo et al. As under both Hail and Sergalath. So one of the big differences for a start with Fontanelle's is that he puts them all under Sergalath. Okay. And de Secretis then also, and then I don't know if it's that there has to be balance between Sergalath has 8 or 7 plus 1 with the Chad of a Glasses. But so there are made 8 under, or there are found 8 under Hail as well. Now, 4 of those, again, we have record of, we even have offices. Most Verum spirits don't have a big long office. They usually don't include any mention of their heraldry or how they appear. But Secretis names 4 of those as under Satanakia, Haramel, Trimasail, Sogathi, and Sestugriel, and also names Elelegap as under Gliarap the Kaimath. Later, that name, as we've talked about in previous episodes, becomes split up, and I think it becomes split from L'Art Magique from a Welcome Manuscript 983, where this long name gets enjambed to look like a Gliarap and Tarchimathy, which is where the split with the different versions of what the names of the 6 deputies or dukes are. So to return to our point, all 5 of those spirits that are also mentioned from pretty early Verum manuscripts, Haramel and Co. and Elelegap, listed by Fontanelle under Hail with these other 3, with Tharithimas, Damaston, and Nelbaroth. Nelbaroth is probably one of the other Nebaroses, which are spelled slightly different. And you even see this repetition of them in the Grand Grimoire. And Jake wrote a fair bit about that, about what he calls ghosts, which is a slightly confusing term, duplicates, who now seem to actually have a life of their own as well, because the Grand Grimoire has Nebaros as a deputy, and under Nebaros is another spirit called Nebiros, or it's spelled slightly differently. So they also have distinct functions as well. So that looks likely to me. But again, I don't know where these other 3 are from. Now, it's worth pointing out that is Verum just listing off other spirits and then finding other deputies for them? Kind of, but there is a logic to it. The main 18 of Verum, the ones beginning with Bechad and ending usually with Huktigaris, although Huktigaris isn't always included, are listed in the earlier manuscripts as under Sirach. And that's because if we're going off to Secretus, Sirach is the first deputy or duke of Lucifer. And after that catalogue of spirits, it then says, where is it? Quote, there are many other daimons which are also specifically under Duke Saturnakia, i.e. the second duke. So it's almost like we've listed off all the first dukes. Spirits now will list off some of the second dukes. The Secretus says there are 54, of which 4 are the principal ones. And this is, again, Heramael, Trimasael, Surgathi, and Sestubriel. And also then says, and the magic can be adapted by us, but we will remain silent about the rest because they would be pointless to expound. And then goes on to say, oh yeah, also Aglirep Kaimath has a chief that's most important to think about, which is Elelagap, who rules all the waters, and sometimes all the waves, and sometimes all the travel on waters, or anything that can be done with water. And so it's another example of how Verum and other grimoires, mostly, with some exceptions, don't posit their lists to be exhaustive or complete accounts of every spirit ever. More often, I think, you find that the refrain is like, these are the main ones, right? These are the ones we've encountered most, or these are the most powerful, or the most senior, by which you will call the nameless millions under them. And again, senior doesn't necessarily mean the same as powerful, but useful, right? Crucially, right? Here are the ones that can be most easily worked with. And I think that's one of the things worth foregrounding in all of this, is that the spirit lists and the spirit catalogs and their hierarchies of the European grimoire practice are as much for magicians who are looking to work with these spirits. I'd argue more for us, to be honest, as I continue doing this stuff, than they are any kind of like immutable laws of the spirit world. Now, to be clear, Verum frequently repeats that the protocols within it are the protocols that the spirits have given, or at least approved of. These are their characters, and you should call them by that because that's what they've agreed to come through. But again, that doesn't make them necessarily actual cosmology, right? It might be part of that cosmology, but it doesn't mean it's the same thing. Grimoires are instruction books, right? They're records of some spirits across human space and time. They're flowcharts for getting things done. They're maps. They're not inviolate territory. And so the fact, that the Grimoire Verum is like, there are at least 54 other spirits. We're only going to talk about 4 of them because those are the ones that are really good at magic and that you can work with, especially if you're using pentacles, says De Secretis, and then goes off in its other section to talk a bunch about what it means by pentacles far later on. But I think this idea that if you can't find it in the catalog, it's not real, it would be very alien to an awful lot of pre-modern grimoire magicians. And so again, as we talked about with Damaston, I just because again, good practice for when you come across something you don't know, even from a set of things that you know a lot about, a small piece of it, to be like, okay, I can't find much record of Tharithimas. Even just like I think one of the only things that did pop up in even just like snooping around Google was a Brazilian death thrash band called Tharithimas. So I was like, oh, but they are Brazilian. Ah, interesting.
But I can't. The 3 demons born of the castration of the true grimoire by the testicles being thrown into the salt water outside, the Bay of Bahia.
Exactly. And even with I was saying, even with Damastan, there are a couple of there's words that you could squint at and see a bunch of different demons in. And as I say, I think Nebaroth is pretty close to one of the spellings of the other Nebaros. But I have not found anything even close to Tharithimas.
It's interesting because what this means too is that this synchronization with demons, as Fontanelle presents it, which is interesting. It's generative. It re-enters it creates its own canon that now there are lineages of Quimbanda that work very much with Exu as if it is a demon from a very European perspective. We know that the older sources of this inspiration of this thing called Quimbanda are usually more rooted in African worldview of at least one ethnic group. that then through contact and contagion starts incorporating things because canon gets created through best practices, through personal gnosis, through revelations, through a specific spirit guiding someone who's very effective, and therefore that spirit lays down the laws for how it wishes its community to continue. But what's interesting about this is I'm sure there are people that are approaching this demon, Tharithimas, Tharithimus, as equivalent to Kaminaloa or the same exact entity as Kaminaloa, and I'm sure have developed sigils for them and continue to call, and it might even be possessing people in some level. And the question is always like, does that mean that everything we do is false, or does that prove that everything is possible when you have a certain technology, a certain predisposition, and that there's to follow a KO role of like what you invest your belief in will prove itself to you over and over.
Yeah, that if there's a space for a spirit to come through under a name, especially if it's given a bunch of power over other spirits, as with the case with Tharithimas, something will turn up. Like, again, we can look at the grimoire transmission as historians, which is important, but also as people that live and work in an inspirited world. Yeah, the name alone might be enough to call something through. Preferably, you want to look at other things and see, well, who do they roll with? That seems to be Jake's reasoning and experience for finding Lucifuge Rofakale coming through Tharithimas, and he kind of identifies them as the same thing because he was looking at where else do the other six deputies mentioned? Well, Grand Grimoire, where if Tharithimas isn't in the list, but there is another sixth, who's that other sixth? Lucifuge Rofakale. So having context is useful, and like you said, having actual technologies, it doesn't mean anything goes. But yeah, if you've made a space for them, if you've left that statue out and not said specifically only this spirit can come through, and especially like only this spirit who agrees to abide by these protocols, then you're going to get hangers on and you're going to get squatters.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it still goes right back to the thinker thinks and the prover proves. Like I can't fault that logic of half the time. I think I know you and I have discussed, but like the older lore is that you didn't draw a sigil to call the spirit. The spirit came because there was an invitation or there was music or feast set out for it. And then it affirmed its ponto to show you who it was. And that, then it would say, I'm Father Seven Winds, or I am Mother Bridgebreaker, or these, generally those are very in line with how we think of Bantu Angola, Congo Angola spirits, and how they work, similar things across the various different Congo diasporic traditions across the Caribbean as well. As these lists get put up and you get something like Kaminaloa, who has, by this point, especially from Fontanelle onwards, where people are kind of recycling and quoting the published accounts of who these spirits are, lest you disagree in a bad way, right? That there is something that Kaminaloa is always connected. The Exu that is corresponding to Tharithimas is connected to something called the Mosorobi, which is an enigmatic line. So kingdoms tend to describe where a spirit is found and their agency within the natural world. Our first documentation of those things is through Osvaldo Mobatala and his works, although many people claim that it existed before them, but it's a very convenient way to work with spirits. And the challenging one to this is lines, which is kind of developed as a shadow to Umbanda's rays and lines that they use. But here was the linea izquierda, right? The left line that was in its own way 7 different lines, Malay being in there, Nago being in there, Mosorobi being in there, the cemetery being in there. Just the ways that these spirits work was described by their line. And Mosorobi is specifically connected to the mental and the phantasmagorical, the world of illusion and fantasy. There's a little bit more air to how they are, and that they are said to be able to travel great distances at once, especially in dreams. Their Mosorobi, many people feel, does come from Mosoromim, and like even the conceptions of the Iberians that were Muslim, that were cast out with the discovery of the New World, and to further that, you get something like the Malay ethnic group of Africans who were Muslim when they were enslaved. And so there's this association of the Mosorobi with Islam, with foreign magic, and Islam in Iberia has a very this is the pagan magic that survived. like the fairy lore in Iberia, it should be stressed, is heavily tied to Jinn. And, the queen of the fairies in a lot of Spain is called the queen of the Moors. And there's this constant conflation back and forth with the people that were there before and the exotification of their magic and their culture. So Kaminaloa has a lot of that kind of wears the shadows or the clothing of many cultures, being perhaps, according to some Umbanda stories, being that he is perhaps Malay himself, Black Muslim African enslaved, who then converts to Christianity while he's briefly a slave or learns about it in some way and absorbs that, and then runs away and lives with the indigenous populations and absorbs their magic. And so he is described as an African who is dressed like an indigenous person with piercings and feathers, and he wears a feathered cape famously, but is able to throw on a hood and kind of pass in the larger cities as someone of great civility, even though he does not ever wish to be called such. So it's an interesting Eshu who is considered to be one of the more powerful and rare ones, just because there is a reputation that he is extremely powerful and educated in many types of magic, and that with Maria Molambos, he heads this Mosorobi line that is very mental, dream-based, fantasies, illusions, which there's nothing more powerful than a dream and nothing more sad than, when it's crushed. So there's something very heavily there with Kaminaloa, very much tied to, I'm told by some people, to Quimbanda Musuramin as one of its primary spirits, and approached in a different way. There are people that are very, very good at differentiating the different way the lines worked. I know there was a guest on Ingrid's podcast, footnote, because I can't remember his name right now, but he was doing a really interesting job of delineating even the difference between Nago, Malay, and Musuromim. Musuromim being an inheritance of kind of the Jinn magic, or the understanding of spirits as things can be tied to very small objects, and that it wasn't big earthy, but there were still sacrifices and time and dedication that were demanded. And this works into the Mosorobi line, and that Nago line is dirt and blood and bones and soil and all these things that are extremely tied to permanent shrines and permanent power objects, where the spirits live within, by the sorcerer manipulating nature to create a microcosm where the spirit can be comfortable. But this is an extremely heavy practice, and this takes up spirits like Nago. And then by the time you get to Malay, that this is really kind of inheritance of the worship of dead kings, and it's tied to other forces, that you could work with any of these spirits in any number of ways. However, there is a cultural inheritance here, or perhaps an informative experience, informative tracing of lineage, to understanding that there's this aerial nature, there's this incredibly heavy earthy nature, and then there's this one that is about like dead kings that will give you the authority to work your magic. And so that gets projected also onto the known context of things like Fontanelle, where the deputies assume this thing called Malay. The Linea Malay are the deputies under the guidance of the Second Crucialiadas of Ashtaroth, and they are the ones who can come in and are considered most stable and approachable by anybody, but also are, very wise and will exact, like, you owe me this, you owe me a beer, you owe me, a goat, you owe me your time, you owe me flowers at a crossroad at midnight, that type of thing. And they want their testing of character, as opposed to the Nago spirits, which are broader, and like, as long as you give the right blood offering and the right dirts and under the right tree, under the right moon phase, like, it's going to work. So, which is a different type of magic. And that seems to be those spirits that are heavily underneath Sirah, Hale, and Sergathi is
Sergalath.
Okay, yeah. So, like, I'm bad with the demon correspondences. I apologize.
There's lots of surges in there. There's a lot of them.
It's a power surge. So I Kaminaloa, quite interesting Eshu. There's a lot of different lore about him, everything from being like one of the most evil and powerful to just being one of the ones that's very good at defying categorization. And also one that is stabilized by the presence of other Eshus like Eshu Ganga or Mangueira, and that Maria Molambo often softens him up as well. But that this is an Eshu even associated with the death shamanism that is written about anthropologically heavily, of like people killing in the sleep, in sending their spirit out to hunt others down in their sleep, which you have parallel things all across indigenous societies of dream magic, of dream henchmen that will come kind of what's the movie? Uh, Inception, their way into your life
Mm.
and your dreams and cause damage. So I think it's probably a good amount about Kaminaloa. It's a very strong spirit, very opinionated. I have found it interesting that the people who have this spirit close. I've seen this spirit mount in Brazil twice, two different people, very polite, and they're just, they're very good at appearances when they want to be, but a very classically presenting Exu when it comes. For those that know what that means, just it sounds like an Exu of Quimbanda. The catchy, so
Mm.
you can smell it in the air.
Mm.
But associated with smoke, like dark charcoals and black you use. People think that you have to use black chalk to call him and all these other things. Sure, go with whatever, your house says or what you say. But I find it fascinating that there's these three issues that are getting brought up together through their correspondences, right? Of
Yeah.
where do we go from here type of thing.
Right.
So thank you for throwing the monkey wrench in there of Ganga Kaminaloa Kirombo, being like you boys are homeless. We don't know where you came from. Um, so if anybody has any clues of why Fontanelle pulled these names here, please write and I'll quote you. Like I'm very
Absolutely. Yeah, would love to know.
so little diatribe there over. It's funny when you have opinions, right? I mean, like who knows? I mean, this Gnostic flash of insight that Fontanelle had to whether he came across practices that already did this syncretization, or more than likely he studied this and built this syncretization for the point of publishing.
Yeah.
In my opinion, the way it reads, but
Hmm.
fascinating in that way of like, okay, I think there's an easy transition to, because we've already been talking about it in so many ways of like, what exactly is gnosis,
Yeah.
and how it comes. So sick of the sound of my own voice. Would you like to start to answer that, Hal? Or put the
Sure.
date on it?
Yeah. Stick a quarter in me. Yeah. I think we can think about, or at least I have, of the things I've encountered. I think we can think about three kinds of approaches to gnosis. I don't want to start trying to the thing up itself, but gnosis from the Greek knowledge or awareness, often counterparted as like personal knowledge. I might even say like a priori rather than priori, if I've got those things right. Philosophers tell me. It often distinguish many languages that distinguish like knowing as something that can be proven or that you can work out versus something that you just know. Kennen versus Wissen in German, for instance. But right, gnosis, like some kind of knowledge or awareness or I guess truth, value. And I think the three approaches I see are historical approaches to gnosis. What was the spiritual truth of the people that got called Gnostics? Where we've got and then there's like actually trying to do what they're doing, right? Spiritual gnosis, and then there's tied up with like visionary revelation and things like that, and then other things that get called personal gnosis. And that to me is mostly talked about in terms of unverified or unconfirmed personal gnosis, UPG, which is a dirty word sometimes. So in terms of like the historical stuff, we've got the idea of a bunch of fun heresies, heterodox bunch of fun heresies, the secret truths of Jesus, as well as a bunch of both conspiracism and conspiracy theory, right? And when the ism of Gnosticism comes in, again, as we said, we need to remember that they're a bunch of different ideas and cults. And again, as Pagels pointed out, some of Irenaeus's stuff about how all Gnostics are, sexual deviance is not accurate, but that's a great example of the way that there is a breadth. And it seems some other scholars kind of suggest that the stuff we got in against heresies was maybe accurate about some people at some point. So that leads a lot of people into like, okay, so what were they? The D and Enochiana thing of like, okay, we can study what D did, but what can we do with what he found? And that kind of, I think, on a practical level, becomes it's important to ask the question of like, how is gnosis not just knowledge, or rather, just knowledge dismissively versus just knowing as a single term, and that's where like just knowing reminds me of, say, like, Ars Notoria stuff about praying for the knowledge of, say, a sick patient's prospects that just gets apparently beamed into your head by angels, right? Or you say the prayer and then count how many times the patient coughs afterwards, and that will be your answer. So then we're into some like kind of setting yourself up for a divination where the knowledge, where the answer is given by observation once you have done that thing. And the beaming into your head thing makes me think of Philip K. Dick that I wanted to touch on as well. But I was also going to say that the main experience I've had, at least in my own practice, other than, you know, trying to get my head around a bunch of conflicting and sometimes quite romanticized takes on historical Gnosticism, which I feel is like well expressed by the fact that like Gnostic gem as a category basically just means magic gem, right? Like depending on how people are using it. And it still crops up in some like modern, more detailed and
like saying scientific in the Caribbean.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Is it not a science? Yeah. It's a term that's meant to grant, if not authority, then a sense of like mysterious depth, right? But after kind of encountering a lot of that stuff and being like, how do we pull apart what a bunch of people said about it versus what people were doing, often in secret? Most of my actual experience of gnosis in my own magic and life really does come from like reading a bunch of chaos magic and then giving it a go. And in those contexts, you know, chaos magic talks about gnosis as like a mixture of things. There were inhibitory models, exhibitory models, anything from an idea of like single pointed focus to an absence of thinking, a kind of no mind, or like often compared to samadhi, that it was talked about as something you could access through meditation or drugs or like infamously orgasm. And often it's framed as, the mechanics of it are framed as allowing the ritual you're doing, the sigil you're casting or the working you're doing to flow unimpeded into the unconscious where it works its effect. I think it's Phil Hine, who talks about talking to the deep mind. Certainly him and Jan Fries talk about indifferent vacuity, right? As this like kind of third method that there's that it can be, that the main problem with doing magic is that your brain tries to work out what's going on and that you get in your own way. And so you're attempting not to suppress thought, I guess, because then you're also thinking about not thinking about it, pink elephants and all, but that like through not worrying about it, like that was more likely to succeed in some way. But again, a chaos magic approach is about getting things done, ideally, right? And about what does this mean, not just in terms of an appeal to a cosmology, so much as like what are the mechanics of what I have to do or not do. And again, thinking about unconfirmed or unverified personal gnosis, which kind of widely emerges from that. So less gnosis as a technique or goal of successful spell casting. So this circulates as a term to describe, often to describe occultists who are just convincing themselves of things, right? So less an awareness and more a new belief or a secret belief or a sense of having a glimpse of what's going on what's really going on, right? And because they're, you know, it's sometimes also framed, it's the idea of like, what does verified mean? What does confirmed mean is a really useful set of questions. But quickly, it also therefore becomes a way to discredit people that you don't like or trust, right? Like, oh, that's just UPG. And I occasionally, you know, still see people criticizing this use of it in a derogatory manner, you know, not unfairly, without due attention to the idea of it meaning that you're just convincing yourself of the thing.
Yeah, or even the using it in a derogatory manner means that people are less likely to share their UPG, which then if people share the UPG and they, you know, people are starting to align in a great majority, and not just the Fatima effect of like everyone starts seeing the same thing because they want to, but like genuinely, you know, what was the classic example? It's probably from somebody problematic now or something. I'm not sure because it's northern, but the idea that like if Freya in your dreams comes to you and tells you to give her strawberries, there's no specific lore about that. But if you start talking to other people and find that they're all giving strawberries to Freya on Friday, then
Right.
like a group of people can work with that.
Yeah.
But and the idea I think that's important too is that like from the history of religion and philosophy perspective, like all traditions start with this understanding of gnosis that then gets accepted or co-developed and co-written by a community, usually within a specific cultural context, to answer the value sets of that community.
Yeah.
And
Confirmation can come from community.
yeah, and so and even that, even the mob mentality, it might not even be that it's verified personal gnosis, but just like agreed upon, the direction towards which we would like our gnosis to go. It's, moving the window towards something new. So like the difference of like even in Valentinian hypothesis of like you have the people that are having genuine gnosis are a specific type of people, the spiritual people. Then there's psychic people who are regular Christians. So the regular Christians are able to have knowledge of Jesus, but they're not having gnosis in the same way. And like the differentiation there, like they have a familiarity with the text, the scripture, but they are not directly experiencing gnosis, which then starts to make it seem. And then there's people who are, not they're going to be whatever recycled, but it starts to have this kind of personalization to the text that we talk about with like initiation. That initiation in a system does not mean that you're knowledgeable in the system. You have to kind of reinitiate yourself through the decision of study and moving through it and making it your own while still honoring the tradition. And that's true of every tradition, or else the things don't get passed down. It's
Right.
it is more than just by rote. It is by rote with an intention to reproduce, and that is its own difference there. So it's interesting to me the notion of and the judgment for personal gnosis, especially outside of where, because if you talk about it, you can then get people to differentiate and hopefully educate themselves and speak about it when people do have outbursts of what is obviously projection or desire of they want to have a relationship with a deity from a closed system or a culture that they feel that they shouldn't have regular access to. And I would still quote paraphrase the Chumbly thing of like if you call the gods and they come, who can say aught? Like fuck off,
Right.
everybody. But at the same time, people that want validation on the public sphere, whether it's for the great almighty capitalist endeavor or just social currency, then they're gonna, that's its own thing too. Of like, well, why do you want that validation when you are not willing to become a part of the community or the culture or those things as to what those things are?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
uh,
I think digging further into that, the distinction between whatever your personal gnosis is, taking it as an achievement in of itself rather than a signpost along the way. Like the strawberries is a great example because then, well, did you give her strawberries? Or the thing
yeah,
that was shaped like her that said it would do this thing? Did they do the thing? Like, what does this? What do you do with this? And where do you go from there, as opposed to just an uncritical, like kind of. Oh, you can be critical about it, I guess, but like, yeah, it is an achievement or a pride in a vision overtaking what you do about it. Just
mhm,
seems very alien to historical spirit work and mysticism, right? Like I think every tradition culture that works with spirits has a version of believe not every spirit, right?
yeah.
Whether that's like, oh, there's the possibility that this is some kind of projection or just a nightmare, whether or not that's an entity, or it is an entity, but it's not the one you should like. It's not the one it says it is, or all sorts of things, right?
Or that
There's
your agendas don't necessarily have to align just because you're passing somebody on the street.
mm,
Even as simple as that of like we're
yeah,
not we're the centers of our world, but we're not the center of the world. Um,
right. And
and
I
and
want,
that's the
yeah.
own thing there. Sorry, go on.
No, no, no. Like exactly that potential of solipsism that I feel. I don't know. I think there's a piece here, and I might be getting way into just polemicizing myself, but like, I think there's a piece that's emergent from not actually divesting from disenchantment fully. And again, this is disenchantment. It's itself been rightly criticized as a Eurocentric idea. There are plenty of people that were like, the Enlightenment can do what it likes. We're going to keep doing this thing, thanks. But the idea that that when you reject the idea that none of this is true, then you just jump towards like, well, all of it must be true. Then all spirits and all things that I think are spiritual experiences must be true. It's on some level a rejection of modern atheism without an actual acceptance or complete understanding of an alternative, right?
Or even
But like,
nihilism on that level, you know, it's
yeah,
yeah, there's something I remember there was, you know, in the discussions of like what is gnosis and the lovely pagan study groups of my yester youth. And I had a teacher that had a wonderful way of saying the difference between just knowledge or familiarity with something versus Gnostic insight, which is often how it's, you know, translated as well. That the knowledge that makes you breathe in, the revelation that makes you breathe in like it's food, like it's sustaining you, those aha moments were when she said it was like there's like a physical sensation associated with it that they were like things click in, like there's an alignment. And there's different cultural descriptions of what that is, you know, whether it's alignment with the Ori, like this type of thing. But there is something interesting to that, like even when it's how can gnosis be contagious in like the Pentecostal way of someone has an insight and you still go when they because it transmits to you and you have to breathe it in like it's food. And like, you know, in the Japanese world they're going to talk about impressions in this way, like here's an impression that you're digesting in that way. And like the world of impressions is often the world of the devil because you know impressions will always arise no matter what you do, and so you don't necessarily want to give credence to all of them, but some of them of course will be bodily sensation, not just intellectually centered, and that is already the first sign that there's something different because it's multiple centered. The reaction to it in my limited faulty experience of reading and talking to people with such, but so I like the idea that there can be a reaction that is already showing you as something different, and certainly we know those types of conversations, or even to a certain extent, the gnosis of attraction and love that keep people on the phone all night with someone, and every new detail is like food. Now, is that knowledge as to how the universe functions? Well, it's knowledge about how your universe functions. How, you know, exciting that new love is, which I do think is its own form of. Is it Gnostic revelation? No, but is it a form of gnosis? Yeah, I mean, there's something there. You can learn a lot about yourself and your world by falling in love as often as you can.
Not just a personal gnosis of the world, but a worldly gnosis of the personal.
Yeah. So yeah, I think there's something beautiful about all that. What's interesting with like if gnosis is what drives revelation and all philosophical insight that is more than just, you know, extrapolative masturbation upon, you know, theory upon theory upon theory, which, you know, if we take it back to the Valentinian of like what is worldly will be destroyed by fire, and then, you know, what is psychic will at least have some relationship to the demiurge because there is like a perverted version of the truth in there. But and then ultimately those things that are purely spiritual will go past even the need for the creation of this world and enter into, you know, the pleroma with no physical body or soul. And that's I think that's true of even for some reason the Gnosis has that too of the different types, how things build us together. I really there are a lot of people that of course will like the modern Gnostics, the people who call themselves as such, outside of things like the OTO and Thelema, but like even there a little bit of comparing it to especially Vajrayana Buddhism, but Buddhism in general, and even the relationship between the need to escape the world versus understanding that the world of spirit and matter are inextricably bound, and there's like achieving enlightenment isn't about escape, it isn't about desire, and adding that kind of Vajrayanic principles onto the Bodhisattva vow, kind of onto modern interpretations of Gnosticism, has been very interesting to see how that's, especially since probably the 70s, those things that are incorporated, developing some form of bodhicitta as part of your Gnostic practice is quite fascinating to me. That this is the way that these things merge together.
What do we do about it, right? Like, okay, so the world's a black iron prison, or this material world. Like, what do you do about that? How do you live in that confinement? What are the emphases? What are the things you either like get to celebrate and cherish, or what's the work to break patterns and cycles?
Okay, so you just went like three places that are really fun as far as where we go, right? Like what is the what is the world, what is the container. Like we're talking Carker and world card.
Yeah.
And I do think that there's some kind of bridge between Gnosis itself as at least philosophical Mercury through which revelation happens, in the sense that like mineral Mercury attaches itself to gold and therefore, can purify, the apotheosis of matter happens through this, that you can make gold and do the great work through the physical properties of Mercury and its parallel to philosophical Mercury. It attaches itself to the most essential nature of something, the incorruptible nature of something. And that maybe with Gnosis, like, just because you had a Gnostic insight doesn't, like, does that mean it's that it's inherently true? In modern parlance, no. It may have been at one point, but that you can have an insight that you have to then test, right? Like, or is it only for you? If a spirit tells you to do something, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work for other people. That sigil might not work for other people. That offering might not work for other people. That was that spirit's relationship with you, your unique ancestry, DNA, worldview, position on the astrological ley lines of the planet. All those things could be there, and entirely unpersonal to you as well. Possibly with like that spirit's like, at this point I can do it with you, and because you are the person who is at the right time at the wrong place. So I don't know, but I'm curious the relationship there between like the stone Mercury and the philosophical Mercury, but also Carker, as I know we're not doing as heavy influence with tarot and geomancy, but the ability of Carker to contain things, or as the world itself, because there's obviously a Carker reference on the Vesca Pisces of the world card that is there, of containing all possibilities from womb to tomb, and is a very hungry mother point, to follow the state park that they happened upon last month. But like, I'm curious the relationship between all of those things. Like, how do we contain the flash of Gnosis to be able to be repeated, to be able to be of use, and to be able to generate more of itself? Which is kind of like anything of like whether it's that orgasmic feel, the sensation that goes with it, but can that insight be prolonged? Can we keep breathing in and sustained by a Gnostic insight? And geomantically, there must be some way for Carker to be related to the containment of all things. In that way, in the same way that Odimeji is all the problems of the world, right? The gossip, the intrigue, the backstabbing, the adultery, the things, but it's also, therefore it contains the whole world. And it is the Odu of diviners and people that can do anything they want as long as they put their mind to it, which means a pain in the ass Odu. But like, this is the where the grave was first dug, quite famously, even as quoted in Mars Volta. But like, there's Odi's propensity to be able to birth anything seems to be directly tied to Carker's ability to contain anything.
The hermetically sealed vessel, the circle that becomes your whole world. Yeah,
and then I guess sigically to have the world card, the Aeon card, to be the circumference of that which can be contained within experience, perhaps within the physical universe or within the physical sensorium of the body, and perceive that which can be perceived. There might be more there, but it definitely seems to be an inclusive of the entirety of the universe's sensorium is quite enough for one card. It doesn't need to be more than that. Like the spiritual beyond that, it's contained in there too. But anyway, I dropped the 3 balls in your court and see where you would like to go with those, Saint Stephen. I'm stoning you with good ideas
in a bad way, in a good bad way. Well, it's interesting that looking at the history of the world card, that it's not always at the end, right? We think about like the closing of the circle, the end of the run of the major arcana, but very often it seems judgment was at the end, and so again, the world is the world at the moment, not the hereafter. Although the earliest decks have definitely a sense of like the allegory of fame in the physical universe, followed by the final judgment of eternity. And what's even more interesting is that like before it's a Vesica Pisces, it's an actual circle, right?
Yeah.
It's some form of like
Until it was in the American headlines, and then they had to squeeze the sides in.
just couldn't get the telegram ASCII
Yeah.
keys to work
Certainly,
right.
the Episcopacies is the American to the British Circle.
Yeah. So it might be an end of the current world. Like again, millenarianism isn't just about the end of everything. It's the 1,000 or however aeonic you want to do period of Christ's return and rule, and then God puts all the pieces back in the box. So, in the city of God in Revelation being talking about both a new heaven and a new earth. And that seems to be what's being depicted in these earlier cards. But it's not the city of God either. Like it doesn't have any of the lovely things in Revelation, the 12 gates with the 12 angels, the streets literally paved with gold, and crucially, often that vision has the giant lamb in the center because there is no temple, because the Lamb of God is the temple. But the Italian world cards didn't look like that. They're usually an actual medieval city. There's one gate, there's no lamb, there's often a big temple in the middle. But they are a circle in the middle of a bunch of other stuff, which is definitely talked about as part of the geocentric universe, which again is, you've talked about a lot, actually has the devil at the center ultimately, right? Sitting there in his magma cocoon at the center of it all, trying to work out, as opposed to God on the borders trying to work in. The Vescopaisi seems to come pretty early, as soon as there's a shift from depicting a city to depicting either Christ or what's pretty clearly the Virgin Mary assumpted into heaven, right? The other term for Vescopaisi I learned was Mandorla. And so I don't know when I think this starts to put the world at the end as well, because you also have the dancing virgin or mother with her feet in the way of the same 1 foot behind the other, but one foot behind a more standing foot, as a kind of reversed hanged man position. And with her arms, it looks pretty similar to the one we have now. Like there's not a lot of shift from that. She's usually got the 2 arms down, holding the 2 batons as well. And so is often read as by the time it's not necessarily the Virgin Mary specifically, but the Anima Mundi more generally. It's also said to be, enacting the glyph of alchemical sulfur. But yeah, at least by the late 17th century, the Type 2 Marseille deck has her, obviously female central figure, red scarf, 2 small ones, and that's also, illustrative of the way that with the revival of all this Platonic and Neoplatonic philosophy of the Renaissance, there's a lot more interest in the spirit of the world, in the soul of the world, and so we get all of this sense of all of the alchemists talking about the facility for change and transformation. So we still got that sense of a renewed paradise of some sense. Of course, the other part of it is the blend of the elements in the 4 corners, which we can ascribe to our man Irenaeus. It seems to be his interpretation of Ezekiel's vision in the Old Testament, that associates the 4 beasts with the 4 evangelists. Although, as I learned in doing a bit of research for this, they're not exactly the same as the ones we use now. Epiphanius switches John and Mark, which is so that Irenaeus's idea of Matthew as the man, John as the lion, Luke as the ox, and Mark as the eagle gets swapped, so that Mark becomes the lion and John becomes the eagle. But he seems to be the one that, if not invents, then at least popularizes the idea that that's what's going on here. And so we have this idea of the 4 parts of the world, the 4 humors, the 4 letters of the name of God are all coming together for this completion of a successful project, which seems to move from more 18th century documents that talk about it as a long journey or a change of location to the completion of a project or the end of a period of personal growth or of spiritual breakthrough. And then obviously by the modern era, that's starting to be talked about in specifically psychological terms as, self-actualization and psychic wholeness. But we do have that, sense of the start of the circle meeting the end of the circle by that point, and the containments that it can produce, and how worldly that can be. That the world card is, interpreted more and more spiritually, or in different spiritual ways, perhaps might be a way of saying that, but that it's still grounded in the world, right? And that's again where, I think we can come back to Karka, right? Like the Saturnine figures, Karka and its Saturn sister Tristitia, are both pretty bad news bears in specific house delineations. Karka is long periods of bad stuff like sickness. It's being stuck in a position where someone else's authority is limiting or hurting you. It's also how our bad actions trap and limit others. There's a general lack of love, a general sense of like many evils. But there's this emphasis on material difficulties over spiritual ones, which I think are a lot more frequently found in Tristitia. Yes, Karka can be useful for I bind you from harm, Nancy, but it doesn't generally connote like spiritual interference or bewitchment via imps and familiars, which is absolutely Tristitia's bag.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's especially when you're not just asking what's going on of Karka as especially like a judge, where it speaks of being locked in, but that can be like good for focus as well as no, you are locked out of change of wider news. But if you're asking like what to do about it, what to do about a situation and Karka's up, it's advising better boundaries, better discipline, better deadlines, and better focus. It's all that Saturnine stuff about being mortal and having limited time, and how do you either try and have the most time or do the most with your time. There's a figure that came up a lot in pretty much every reading I did for a client during lockdown. Like I think we can say it is a figure of quarantine after all. It can connote both the isolation of it and the protection it offers. It's definitely a firm no, even traditionally, about going on an adventure. A lot of the queries I had during lockdown that weren't like, how do I get through this, were maybe not a lot, but like a good couple were like, I know everyone's telling me I shouldn't, but I was thinking about going traveling now, and it was a definitive no, that's a bad idea for you and the people you'll infect, like, or and so I kind of graphically, it's a cell, right? Basic building block of life, mitochondria, etc. It's also manacles, right? It's also a wedding band of convenience or politics. It does say that if you're in specific questions of marriage, it says yes, but it won't be a happy one. It's a figure that like locks you in, locks you down, locks you out, locks you up, all of that stuff. And again, it's only one line away from Tristitia,
and Letitia,
and Letitia, right? There's a relationship between all three, right? We can be dour and focus on the negative and talk about how moving from Karka to Tristitia can speak of how quickly external difficulties can become internalized, or vice versa, how quickly, or how losing our heads can dig a sorrow inwards and hollow us out. But Tristitia meeting Karka produces Letitia, right? Awareness of sorrows and our limitations should encourage appreciation of delight, even especially because it's mobile, because Letitia is exiting, because it's fleeting. Karka is what's in the world, not just in our nightmares. And the growing saturnally old and slow is a blessing, way better than the alternative.
Well, it's interesting too. I think going back to tarot card land, right? Like the aeonic inheritance of the universe within the Thoth system, or just the notion of how Aeon plays, like concept Gnostic Aeon, outside of the Thoth deck, even into Rider Waite of this is the perfected world that's inherited after the Last Judgment, right? So this is the physical world sensorium of what would normally be pitted against the spirit, but is here perfected through the renewal of the meeting of the dead flesh with the apotheosis of the flesh. ultimately. So there's something really interesting for me in the contemplation of what Karker is, with relationship to this what are the bounds of the pleasures of the world, well, after this, the second coming and the 1,000 years and everything goes. It reminds me of this meme that was, there's quite a few like cool Christian preachers that have, trying to battle against the how many uncool Christian preachers there are on the condemnation of things. But one of the things that was, this one guy was just kind of questioning was this girl who was talking about how you'll be locked out of heaven for all time if you don't repent. And Revelation itself, where we get the concept of New Jerusalem, does not have this premise of being cast, that the gates of heaven are actually permanently open. And while 100,000 people do live within the confines of the New Jerusalem, then everybody else is just in the suburbs. And you can still go in and witness the glory of God. So it's interesting there, because if I think about Karker and its line transformation into Tristitia or Letizia, that you have the abandonment of fire or earth. And rooted in the earth, if it has to burst open, then it seems like, we lose the awareness of fire, and therefore it becomes Tristitia. We lose that warmth, and it descends into the earth, even its shape is going that way, right? And then
the open grave,
if we're focusing too much upon the joy of the confines of the world here, that we lose the sense that we are fleeting, that we lose the grounding in the earth, and therefore it is hard to maintain this joy. So there is kind of this weird, for me, like attachment to pleasure, attachment to the pleasures of the sensorium alone can't be balanced out when time is a factor, right? That's like part of the whole thing of what pleasure is our compartmentalization, that we think the pleasure we feel right now is going to last forever. And our inability to see the end of our good sensations, vibrations. So there's something really beautiful about Karker in that way, that the containment is fragile, but is necessary in order to birth new experience, to birth new insight. And the tunnel work seems to work both ways. Womb, tomb, which direction you're going. It is a figure that inherently seems to understand the recycling of and the reuse of energy and transmigration and reincarnation and all these other things that are there, are very heavily within Karker. And then they get echoed in the world, and the as inherited through the journey of the tarot, the journey of the fool through the last judgment into the heavenly Jerusalem. And where do we go from there again? Well, I guess it's like Mother, and it all starts over again. Drink your golden calf, experience the tortures of the world, and let's create the world anew, and Bereshit all over again. I'm curious, like, what comes to mind then is the in-betweenness of what physical Quicksilver Mercury is, the idea of liquid metal, apart from, Terminator 2, because that was a big thing when I was in junior high, junior high, or elementary school, of just this concept of the liquid metal, the morphing that started happening in the early 90s, right? As far as special effects and Michael and Janet Jackson video and everything. Anyway, Quicksilver, mercury as a mineral. We talked a little bit about philosophical mercury and the idea that the thing that flows through all things, that is neither the sulfur nor the salt when we're talking philosophically. So not the physical body or the divine heat, but the fluid menstruum by which things can bind to and create physical form. Which, I guess there's also the side of it that, like, the philosophical mercury of the vegetal kingdom is alcohol. And alcohol pulls into the sulfur of a plant and separates the salt from the sulfur. And you can do things like extracts and make tinctures and see alchemy verify itself through the exact means for which it was created, which is observation of laboratory science to create medicines. And I remember one of several lectures I've been to with David Heinz Smith, of describing in his idea that alchemy and Kabbalah are basically describing the same process, but one has become more divorced from the laboratory, and the other one is intimately connected to it and can't be separated from it. But they are both descriptors of a similar process. And but he's, of course, a minority school within Kabbalah. But I always find that fascinating of mercury being an essential ingredient in order to turn the lead into gold.
Mm-hmm.
Of the red and green lion and the the strong grip of a master mason even. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but this all wrapped up in this incredibly little toxic uh, metal that we call mercury.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and where those metals are things found, and like even the concept of like cinnabar, which is used in art and used in medicine, and there's no every year you can read a different report as to whether or not cinnabar is actually toxic to us, or if it's bound in its chemical constituent ways that it's passes through us in that way.
Yeah.
And we worry about heavy metal poisoning. um, and welcome to the jungle. um, I'm gonna what did you find about mercury, the metal?
Yeah, that it well, like Cinnabar specifically, I knew it was old, but I didn't realize like they've found evidence for the Neolithic age of its use in various forms, even if that's not detailed laboratory stuff. I was also struck by to skip to from the beginning straight to the end and then back again, hey cycles, about just how many laboratory uses it has.
Hmm.
Um, some of which I was vaguely aware of, and some of which I was like, oh, it's used for that as well. Good grief! And how often we look for substitutes because it is so toxic, and how often like nope, that just seems to be the thing. Um, yeah, it's if we're talking about morphology and stuff, it's the living silver, right? Which for the Greeks, so I'm going to garble Hydrographus, um, Hydragiros,
And
water
gyro,
silver,
yeah,
right? Water
yeah,
silver, which becomes quicksilver, which also is also living. It's not just that it moves; it's the quick and the dead.
yeah.
Um, and that yeah, the stuff I'm most familiar with is its uses in Paracelsian medicine, really. The alchemy of not just discovering the innuendo, or gnoses of what material things can tell us about spiritual things, but also like how it was utilized to cure physical ailments. That the old adage of like tis the dosage that makes it so seems to be specifically or especially about mercury, and this is one of the big things Paracelsus was known. Again, if we're going to talk about Irenaean warnings and Streisand effects, it's that's what he becomes famous for, because a lot of people like you're using some of these things weren't unknown to be poisonous, right? Paracelsus is like we can use all these poisons and they can cure people, which is especially the one that gets talked about a lot is the mercury cure for syphilis, which I read a couple of reports of modern scientists who are like, yeah, if you got the dosage exactly right, because it will kill bacteria and all sorts of other stuff, yeah, that could work. But if you didn't, you were going to significantly harm or even kill the patient. And again, big flex from Theocrastus, right? Like, well, you might not be able to get the dosage right, but I can.
Yeah.
Um, learning that yes, although Mr. or Dr. Daniel Gabriel Fahrenheit invents thermometers creating mercury, that earlier efforts had been described since in the 18th century. Earlier efforts had been described at least since the 1650s, and then it's based on an earlier design that used alcohol instead. And there's another link back to old Uncle Theophrastus, because he seems to have been the one that coined alcohol, or at least popularized the term itself in English, right? The spirit of the world itself, again. And again, how, yeah, that allows this kind of, whether it's the ultimate form or matter, if we're going to try and compare alchemical principles to Platonic ones, or if it's just the means by which change is allowed, is effectuated between things, of taking things apart to put them back together better in various ways. The old solvate coagula, of which Carco is absolutely the solvate conjunctios coagula. but yeah, God, it founded so many other things like barometers, diffusion pumps, so much other laboratory equipment. Partly because Mercury's so dense, and has as I learned, a nearly linear thermal expansion, and so you can like heat it, and it can do things in a uniform and therefore repeatable manner, right? It speaks of what laboratories are trying to do with its popularity. The stuff about mirrors is fascinating, right? The transit telescopes use it because it will form an absolutely flat mirror, a mirror to the horizon, as well as like a telescope that, as long as you're pointed directly up, will be very, very accurate. And also learning that at least some archaeologists, I don't know which side of what other anthropological debates they're jumping in on, but have argued that some of the caches of liquid mercury found from a bunch of Maya tombs might well have been used to be put in bowls as mirrors for divinatory purposes. I don't know how much that's just, archaeologists phoning it in with like, quote, for ritual use. But yeah, finding it in other tombs as well, found in Egyptian tombs from at least the 1500 before Common Era. So this association with the dead is interesting. If we're going to talk about Mercury psychopomp or very terrestrial Hermes. Yeah, what else? There was some other thing. Oh yeah, it's an explosive as well, right? Mercury fulminate uses a primer for in firearms cartridges. R.I.P. Poor Jack Parsons. I learned a little bit more about Mad as a Hatter, right? Which we're mostly familiar with. I didn't know that the specific process is called carroting, which is lovely. But when you wash the animal skins or rinse them in mercuric nitrate, that compound ends up having an orange kind of color, and thus it's called carroting, and that's what separates the fur and mats the pelt kind of together, and that yes, this is known to be highly toxic from a while away. One of the also goldsmithing, as you pointed out, like we talk about millinery as this like very physically mercurial process, but so was goldsmithing. And some of the reports on one of the many, again, heterodox Christian mystics of the English Revolutionary period that gets called a ranter was Thomas Taine, who renamed himself the Aurora John Taine, and was also a goldsmith. And Ariel Hussein has done some great work on showing that like it's been posited, I think, even at the time, that some of his idiosyncratic, eccentric things, attacking Parliament with a rusty sword, like all of it, declaring himself the true Pope and the king of Reims and various other places, which again was not an unusual thing for prophets to do, may emerge not just but the visions he was having, of which there were many, the things he did with those visions, which were many. He had this whole wonderful notion of that some of that may have emerged from exposure to mercury fumes. Some of the stuff he did with it, though, is amazing. He had this whole notion of divine ignorance. So precisely because he had never been to the lying universities, which were obviously in league with the evil authorities of the world, he was able to translate more perfectly Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, and any other language, precisely because he was too ignorant not to be able to. And so he produces these very strange exegeses of all sorts of things, and makes all sorts of very small g Gnostic claims about the same things that many ranters are interested in, certain forms of antinomianism, an end to sin after the revocation of Mosaic law, that certainly the current rulers got there by sword and by exploiting common working people, and that everyone was God's divine special child, but kind of especially him.
Yeah.
He's a fascinating character, but again, Goldsmith. Ariel Hussein's study on him is even called Gold Tried in the Fire. So it leads people to make fabulous discoveries, some of which are very repeatable in laboratory conditions. And some of Mercury's blessings seem to be a lot more difficult for other people to grok or even believe.
Yeah, Mercury is interesting for many reasons. I obviously talking about it. I don't. That was a horrible segue. I apologize. I think the things that come to mind, a couple, like one is the attempted purification ritually of Mercury within like South Asian culture, whether it's parad, the metal that is, you can buy parad malas, you can buy parad statues, parad lingams, and it's supposedly Mercury, which is Shiva's semen, purified through alchemical means to be a stable element and a solid form. But when scientifically various parads are tested, there's of course no mercury trace in them whatsoever. It's just an alloy of various metals, which could be said to, like, if it appears kind of like a hematite kind of outside, then they've done their job. It still looks like mercury. There's the other side of it, is like, how is this purification if it's just actually just different metals? But parad itself is said to be alchemically purified mercury, by which you can ingest and use on your skin. And the benefits of this is it's like, Shiva's pearl necklace on you at all times. That's interesting. I also, Mercury's history of involvement in slavery is also fascinating, because where you have silver mines, you eventually, by the 1500s, they knew you needed to have mercury to extract from the amalgam, through the amalgam process, to extract silver. And we can look at that even in central Spain, as far as the historical site of Almaden, which together with I think a place in Slovenia are like the big mercury centers of the Roman world, and then moving into the New World. Like Almaden is, which literally means, it's from Arabic, means the metal, or like the load. This is Roman, then Moorish, then Visigoth, then Christians, and it is the largest quantity of liquid mercury produced in the world. Has come from the mines of Almaden. It is considered where you would send penal labor, slave labor, prisoners of war throughout history. It stopped working finally in 2002 due to European mercury mining prohibition, because of toxicity to everything involved. So you can actually go visit the mines, and you can visit the first level, which is, I think, 150-ish feet underground. But the thing with this is that the mines themselves, because of the danger of this, and in time periods where there weren't enough prisoners, the government would make more prisoners, and you needed to find young prisoners that could do mining labor and not die right away. And when that ran out, there is evidence that this is when they started importing slaves from the ruling classes, the strapping children of the quote unquote Moorish, but really the more Central African slaves that were then in Spain, because Spain would not, at the time, there was a big relationship about the slaves having to be Catholic. And so this sets ourselves up for like the whole history of the triangle trade and slave trade in that way too, that by the time you come to Mexico, and they're trying to, in New Spain at the time, and they're trying to find gold, and gold is not as plentiful. It is here, but silver is much more plentiful in the New World. And so they're trying to get silver out. And so you go to mining colonies like Guanajuato of Leon, and there has to be a mercury mine nearby. There's tons of, like, for instance, it's no coincidence, but mercury mines start booming in California around the gold rush era. And then you get like New Almaden and a whole bunch of other mining places in Central California that are producing mercury for people to be able to make it rich with gold and silver in California. But as far as Mexico goes, by the 1600s, just the various imports of slaves to Almaden specifically was that one out of every two people was no longer like penal. It was becoming 2 to 1, excuse me, 2 to 1 ratio of slaves to penal. And that was just because it was easier, of course, slave labor. And similarly in the New World, one of the things that happened was because they had to import mercury, mercury was not found right away. It's harder to, like, you have to go through a lot more process to find where mercury is coming up through the soil in cinnabar form and then refine it. It was imported heavily from Almaden. And then when they found mercury, it was too precious to spend the money that it cost to use African slaves. So African slaves were considered to be good for the house, but not the field, or especially not for the mine. So on average, the cost difference between an Indian slave was 1/10 of that of an African slave. And so if a person was going to the mine, he would buy 100 Indians because they'd be dead in 2 or 3 months. And as long as the profit turned over in that way. So there's this weird understanding and historical context around indigenous enslavement in the New World that is erased solely because it's mine work. And so it can be excused for like, oh, the tragedies of the mines. But like when you're dealing with silver and mercury mining, these are incredibly horrible conditions. And it was just that those were the people there. So they're going to, it decimated the Central Valley people, like the Otomi and the Chichimecas are heavily just enslaved for mining. And it especially destroyed their cultures, language. And that was a quick detribalization and assimilation into Spanish culture because this was your job. Your job was to mine mercury or silver. So mercury as a physical object, and how it goes, just the empire of Spain is directly said to be possible because of the Almaden mine, and because it is in Castilla-La Mancha, so they're able to fund things because mercury is either coming from Almaden or Slovenia in Europe, and then funding the New World exploits of mining and governing everything through the exportation of mercury and selling it everywhere else in the Mediterranean, or the exportation of mercury from the New World along with silver. Anyway, there's a lot there there's a lot of history with mercury in this way.
That's fascinating. Yeah. Wow.
The thing with Jack Parsons is just interesting, right? Because he's said to be playing with the mercury. Oh God, my brain.
Fulminate.
Yes. So it's a highly explosive version. It's funny because I grew up. The high school I went to is right next to JPL, so I was right around the time I was reading who Jack Parsons was. It was easy enough to like go after school or go on when we could leave campus for lunch during senior year or whatever. I would go down to JPL and we went to fairs at JPL all the time. Had to go buy it to get to my high school, so I was like leaving offerings for Jack Parsons Ghost there. But then finding out his address on Orange Grove in South, is it South Pass or might just be Pasadena? But it's on the part of Orange Grove that goes from the Norton Simon down to like the 110 area, which is a common way to get down to downtown Los Angeles, where my grandfather worked at Olvera Street. So when I was 16 and started going, I then was like, I'm going to look up the address. And it's the most, obviously they rebuilt it, but it's like the most boring condos in a very nice area. Like there is a very shishi area. It's down the street from the Wrigley Mansion. I had friends that went to Westridge, which is a high school that's along that area, and it's all girls high school. So it's just interesting. I'm a little visual dirt from where his house was and from where he worked. And just as a matter of like, who knows, just because he was there, right? It was a local dead magician.
Yeah.
To engage with. And LA is full of those wonderful kind of ghosts, as it were. But anyway, it was interesting to hear. I forgot about that with the actual explosion being credited to mercury, because there are many feel that it was an assassination or a murder.
Yeah, seems odd, even if he's packing up his house in frustration or desperation, that someone who spent his life handling incredibly explosive things would do that.
Yeah. The last thing I'll say about mercury, as far as, well, maybe the last thing, because never say never, is the Rubin Museum had a great exhibit, like little alcove on like the third floor about Tanka painting. And one of the things that it was mentioning was that historically in Tibet, great artists of Tankas were often criminals working off a sentence. And part of this was that, in prison, they would want to repent, so they would, I guess, petition to become an apprentice to a Tonka painter. And the Tonka painters would, you spend your life, the first part, like learning proportions and learning the ratios of how these faces and images have to look, and you draw it on the paper, and you have to make, in order for the mineral pigment to adhere to the canvas, which has been primed and everything, they use yak fat. And in order for the gold to adhere to the canvas and certain other pigments, they dipped the paintbrush in mercury in order to paint. But how does a natural artist, we all seen it in cartoons, what do you do with the paintbrush to get its tip fine again? You don't touch it, you put it in your mouth. So to make the point pointy. So there was this aspect where Tonka painters, especially towards the end, when they're masterful in like teaching others to do it, but they're painting certain ways, they're dipping the paintbrush in mercury, putting it in the pigment, putting it in their mouth, paintbrush, pigment, like, so they slowly die of mercury poisoning. And the average life of a Tonka painter is 7 years. So you knew that you were probably going to die. It was known that this was a deadly job, but that you were working off negative karma. And it wasn't even necessarily meant that you was mercury causing the thing. It's just that this is part of your penance. But the average life of a Tonka painter was therefore 7 years because they were working off their negative karma through eating mercury. And developing also the practices that go with that, where they're keeping their wits with them about how to draw really well, but don't remember who the hell they are. So the question of like the longevity pills that contain mercury within Tibetan and Indian practice, the Chinese practice, is questionable. Is it preserving of long life, or is it an understanding that there is a way to work off negative karma through an interaction with mercury? Was proposed, at least in the Reuben, in that way.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, I mean, when does you hear all sorts of at least anecdotal accounts of different kinds of mercury poisoning where technical skills aren't the first thing to go. It's like you said, who you are and how to interact with other people. But like, when do the toxins of the craft consume you? I've heard anecdotally from our mutual friend, Professor Porterfield, similar ideas about old hoodoo workers.
For yourself, mutual. I see you, Charles. No, I had to. I love you, Charles.
The idea of like with the all sorts of uses of mercury in hoodoo and southern conjure, but the old putting it in the nutmeg.
Yes.
Many old workers would have got, their young apprentices with nimble fingers and more robust immune systems to do bits of that for them. Less as a penance and more as a like, you got to earn your stripes kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, we know that mercury is prized in various Afro-Caribbean and Afro-diasporic traditions as a great animator of substances.
Right.
So that when you put it into a bundle, that it creates a life force that can then flow through it. And I have never seen this written, but I'm always curious as to why the French for mercury looks curiously like the priesthood title, right, in Haitian voodoo of Asogwe. But also speaks to people getting dangerously overly familiar with mercury in closed environments, in heated environments where vapors are inhaled. So it's one of those things where you read those candle recipe books from the 90s, 70s through 90s, and there's a lot of mercury being used, and by the 2000s, there's a lot less mercury being used. That's because it's harder to get. Can't just bring a thermometer or get an air conditioner plug anymore. A thermostat plug. With that, I suppose the universality of mercury is interesting to explore in relationship to something like hazel, because hazel is a universally, in the Western English speaking grimoire world, is a universally revered tree for its magical properties.
Yeah.
And yet no one seems to agree on what those magical properties are so much as they're valuable.
Yeah.
And that's fascinating.
Yeah, it's a big wise white tree. It can do it all, baby. Which itself is, kind of big mercurial, right? Has a capacity for doing many things, good with good, ill with ill. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, it's so many different uses, very hard to, so much information for a start, so many accounts of the things, hard to give even broad buzzwords of the things. Yes, turns up in fertility stuff. Yes, turns up in spirit protection. Yes, turns up in spirit conjuration, dowsing, love, divorce, treasure, making things, not just from it, but with it. And yeah, I mean, a wealth of even of planetary correspondences. I think Lily calls it primarily Jupiterian. I think Culpeper calls it Mercurial. Certainly, Christina Oakley Harrington, hi Christina of Treadwell's, advances the idea that both the wand of Circe and the caduceus of Hermes were made of hazel. There's what's some of the other early ones? There's a legend that Joseph of Arimathea uses hazel branches to build the first Glastonbury Abbey, which was fun. But again, like if we're looking for something that can do everything a little bit or that can facilitate other things, I think it's pretty natural to give it Mercury. Mercury as of the seven does kind of a little bit, maybe I think it depends what we're talking about, but like has a little bit of quality of being able to jive with everyone, right? Astrologically, it helps things along. It talks between things, even into the Victorian language of flowers. Hazel's said to represent reconciliation, at least from Valentine's 1867 account. And so that idea, what are we reconciling? Are we when is that reconciling lovers? Yes, there's examples of like give your lover a hazel stick. There's also examples of giving them a hazel stick to signify that you don't love them anymore. Yeah. And then there's a whole bunch of grimoire stuff in terms of at least English cunning, and with some extension into the wider British Isles. If you're making a wand of any sort, whether it's a divining wand, a conjuring wand, a blasting rod, blasting rods, again, we talked about with Blackthorn, but like there are definitely mutilating batons that you use hazel for as well. It's hazel all the way. Unless it specifies otherwise. Often, it's one of the woods for cunning craft, certainly, and a lot of its harvesting at that point aligns with all sorts of other moon lore, right? Commonly cut on Sundays and at the dawn or just before dawn. Often a springy switch of a year's growth that hasn't borne nuts. Often at a waxing moon, and there's even like specific Scottish law about how in general you shouldn't cut hazel or willow for that matter during a waning moon, specifically because this will make the wood too brittle or dry. So there's like practical reasons which again the practicalities of like it's often a hazel switch that's springy enough to be formed into a circle, which you then stretch your skins out for tanning and turning into vellum and parchment, which are, yes, ritualized in various Solomonic grimoires and yes, the Verum and things like that. But that's also just generally how people made parchment that wasn't for summoning demons or angels with. So it's also interesting how often just the everyday crafts are preserved in these things that have also a specifically sorcerous intention.
Similar to like, right, because like the spryness is why I would assume that it was chosen for the maiden garland.
Yeah.
Right, to like it's just or any number of dancing hoops that are used. It's like you have willow, hazel are your primary options to like, is it lithe enough? Is it quick enough to be able to be bent and not snap and keep its strong enough shape that you can weave other things onto it?
Yeah.
So
the garland's a really good example again of its diversity of use, because yes, that was for the maiden garland was for crowning a maiden to go dancing in or waving at people from her cart, but it would also be put in churches when someone died, especially before marriage.
I'm more familiar with it in that way too, and the preservation of that even supposedly in New England folklore, where like to have the maiden garland of a family member, for instance, like it was viewed almost like like a weird, almost Catholic version of a relic. It's a weird that Protestant culture like kept it in that way,
Mm.
and that to have seen supposed older recipes that call from like a lily from a maiden garland as part of like the fertility charm for a new couple,
Mm.
or remnants of flowers from that way, and certainly it evokes for me, and I'm sure many people, like an Ophelia type of
Oh, yeah, yeah. Hamlet literally says, like, he mentions what's the word he uses? Crans, which is a Germanic word for garlands. He specifically mentions that one's going to be put in the church, I think for Ophelia, or he's just kind of like riffing on "You're going to be dead soon."
Yeah, okay. Yeah,
Yeah,
where is it? Just I saw in the wonderful thing that how we digest most of our information now of memes of the model for the language of flowers that's used in Malays, the Ophelia, the floating, downriver,
yeah.
that it's kind of like the weird shape with the rounded top. That the model in that Ophelia in the painting has poppy in her hand.
Mhm.
And the model in that photo died at age 22 of an opium overdose.
Oof,
But coincidence. It reeks of Grant Morrison's "Don't draw yourself in your own comics." Uh,
right.
but yeah, what's striking to me about Hazel is like it's like mm, allegedly, if one takes LSD, how patterns become more intense. It almost looks like the pattern of a birch leaf to me, but when you look at it, Hazel almost has even more striations of like I don't know, they look very bright
Yeah,
uh to me. Um I know that right, like whipping fairies or quote unquote serpents, right, Irish wise, like to cut hazel before sunrise on May Day. And this is the one that you would like if you're being chased, you would draw a circle around yourself with this.
yeah,
Because it echoes St. Patrick's rod.
yeah.
In
And
addition to the one of Cersei and everybody, like everybody's rod is hazel. Uh,
yeah, yeah. And again, like when we're actually into the practicalities of a thing, it's not a contradiction to say this thing can call fairies and also it can protect you from them. What all of the things that you need to do with and against the good neighbors.
yeah. And that I know that I think it's Isle of Skye, that hazel rod, like a walking stick made of hazel, and then you tie that was that folklore I found about the Thor's cross from
Oh yeah,
the bone from when you cook, dissect whatever you're doing with a ram's head or a sheep's head. There are a number of small bones that help give fortification to the muscles of the jaw because they're chewing cud. So the ruminant animals have these extra like bones for fortification, and one of them is very tea-like shaped. And there are ritual uses with this in various cultures, but I found it fascinating that the ram's jaw specifically, probably because of the ram's connection to Thor, this is called a Thor's cross. It does look like a Thor's cross, and this was tied around infants' necks or carried with you when you were traveling. And if you had a hazel rod, that you would tie it to that to prevent you from being fairy taken. Um,
mm,
and that Hazel has the thing of like the fairies can't steal something with Hazel on it, and or livestock with a Hazel cross specifically can't be stolen by fairies, and would prevent against thieves even seeing the animals. But if this double combination of like the Thor's cross that naturally comes from a ram, tying it to a Hazel rod is like fairies leave me alone. Like I'm not the person to fuck with here. So
yeah.
yeah,
You get all sorts of other stuff tied to it as well as a divining rod. One of the old ideas is yes, a forked one will move towards metals, so it has an affinity for them, so you can douse for mineral deposits with it. But there's also an even more direct example of sympathy where, especially in like French, like Jacob's rod traditions, you would tie a piece of the metal you were looking for onto a hazel rod in order for it to be sympathetically drawn to it. There are also plenty of examples of using mosaical rods, as they get called, without anything tied to them, that can lead you to treasure, which is metal usually. In fact, reading through Richard Saunders' 17th century treatise on physiognomy and chiromancy, he actually talks about because for Sanders at least, Chiromancy is just the most obvious example of underlying occult morphology. Like physiognomy, he says, is like the explanation for the degrees of sympathy of everything, of white, like of occult morphology itself, of the shape of things, giving you information about them, giving you gnosis about them, and also their affectivities. He has all sorts of tangents that go into, like, yes, occult philosophy, but also a bunch of folk magic. He says if you can find, it's a fascinating bit of like combining geomancy and palmistry. If you can find the markers of Gemini or of mercurial geomantic figures in a palm, it indicates that person will be particularly good at using divining rods to find treasure, and then goes on to talk about how you make them. And then it's like, oh, but I was talking about letters in the hand, and then goes back to it. So again, this like connection with mercurial things being especially good for galvanizing hazel makes a lot of sense. They're also typically the wands or the staves or the rods, the batons that you would cut in the name of the Magi to find things. And again, the historiola is as the Magi were guided by the star and found the Nazarene, so may I find what I'm looking for.
That's fascinating. I know there's it's either Scots or it's Irish, but that the Star of Bethlehem is that the light, the rays that made it to Earth, such and such are where hazel comes from. Yeah, so like, and that's just associated with wisdom, right? Because of like the Celtic lore around it. I mean, it is on planets, the fairest of trees, and there's a lot of things there. I do like Dana O'Driscoll's American Druidess, and I like her very strong honesty of like, we're making all this up based and rooted in what we have, but like also encourages an intense relationship with the land, and specifically being North American. She's in Pennsylvania, I believe. That she's looking at American plants of the same name or the cognate. So going heavily into American hazel and its uses and why it's different, and what lore there might be around it. And she always goes into the ecology and things like that on her website, which is the Druid's Garden. But I really like her exploration of American trees in this way, because like, look, this is the land I'm on. In addition to native lore, and she does go into like traditional Western magical, traditional lore. And she is big about the idea that in America, witch hazel took over for divining rods, but that American hazel is dramatically inheriting the other parts of the lore, and they should not be interchanged the way that many people do. Kind of like American mandrake has some qualities that are similar to European mandrake, but is ultimately an extremely different plant. And my proposal would be that ginseng actually has more of a lot of traditional mandrake lore than American mandrake itself. And ginseng is, of course, all over the place in the Americas, in North America. But she talks a little bit about, for her, with the divination praxis, that yes, wisdom, that American hazel is associated with wisdom and knowledge, just as the British counterpart, because of the mythology that is cross-transferable, but also for creative inspiration and the flow of the creative force of Awen. And that also as the magic of hazel is in renewable tools. And that I like the fascinating prod that is, because she only has like a small paragraph to it on her site, and in her book that's similar to what she has on her site. But that, quote, hazel offers many tools and gifts for those seeking a sustainable lifestyle and to transition to more sustainable practice. Thus, hazel offers the knowledge and uses of its many tools and the idea of sharing these practices widely. Hazel offers much hope for us to think about how to transition from monocrop agriculture that's destroying the land to instead work with the energy of hazel, a tree that can be infinitely renewable and incredibly generous. It is an amazing seed crop for nuts. So this, I mean, even the salmon of wisdom, right? That it's eating the hazelnuts of wisdom. And the spots on the salmon reflect how many nuts it's eaten. But just as far as a poor person's food, this has gone nuttin', right? Like we're gonna go gather nuts. Oftentimes in folk tales, in a wise Isles way, is talking about hazelnuts, not just they would say acorns if they meant oak trees.
And that's
often the ubiquitous nut.
And that going nutting was also often a euphemism for going and getting it on with your sweetie as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And even in some more diabolic tones, you would even talk about you met the like that girl who came back pregnant met the devil,
Yes.
or that you were going to be pregnant on your wedding day. That implied that there was some funny business outside of the proper order of things, allegedly. Yeah, that's also tied to it's a less common love divination than who am I going to marry, but throwing hazelnuts into the fire. There's
Yes.
some debate about when exactly Nutcrack Night was. Well, it's not debate. It's just that different people did it at different times in different places. But generally around November, sometimes it's linked to actual Halloween as well. But that was where you already knew who your sweetie was, and you were roasting the hazelnuts to see if the relationship would fare well, if they burned steadily, and if a bunch of them flew apart, it spelled at least problems in the relationship, if not an ultimately doomed one. It's interesting with the crosses because they are so ubiquitous for healing, for preventatives, as Scott and Drake and various other people call them, for stopping spirits meddling with your infants or your cattle or your sweetie. That it's another day for it is Holy Cross Day in the middle of September.
Yeah.
Which again is, is it because that's when nuts are around,
Yeah. Yeah.
right. Yes and yes.
Yes, and yes. That's why I love Holy Cross Day because it's just like then like or Scottish joking aside that you actually get to say rude and it means different.
Yeah, and likewise the with its like its catkins in Somerset. It said if you're going to get if there's a lot of catkins, plenty of catkins, plenty of prams, linking the tree with not just giving you fertility, but an indicator of human fertility.
In the interest of honoring a man who I care very strongly about, I will transition to Charabel just out of reverence. But then again, who knows? Maybe I won't have much to say. I don't know what I can force a transition from Hazel to Charabel in by saying that Hazel is not in his book, and it drives me crazy. But in truth, so Charabel, birth name John Thomas, 1826 to 1908, was a Welsh insert term based upon agenda. So he was an astrologist. He was a mystic. He was, in my consideration, a spiritualist, although he did not necessarily like the term, but he made a living being one. He was considered a clairvoyant, an occultist, an herbalist. Most people know him from his astrology book, which the degrees of the zodiac symbolized. But posthumously, he is said to, or before, obviously, he wrote the message before, and he is said to have left his works in manuscripts for publication to one Robert Welch, who published a book specifically called The Psychology of, here it is, The Psychology of Botany, Minerals, and Precious Stones in 1906 in Wales. And so it's dedicated to Robert Welch because he's the reviser of the thing. But it might not be that this is the entirety of the book that Charabel meant to write. He may have been adding to it over time. This has been republished by IHO Books in 2003 as the Grimoire Sympathia, the Workshop of the Infinite, Healing Without Medicine Using the Spiritual Essence of Plants, Minerals, and Precious Stones by Charabel. So this is the book that opened me. I mean, this is, for me, this is Charabel's like genius. And I do, in addition to everything else, fine, he's born in 1826 in Wales. He wants to be a Christian minister. Ultimately, because of the prominence of spiritualism, there's a lot more opened up to people that wanted to be ministers, and they get involved in more things than ministry would allow, and they often start to have careers and beliefs that are outside the normative Christian religions, and therefore, unless you want to be a spiritist, like holding a church, you end up being more of a mesmerist, a hypnotist, a magnetist, people that are finding ways to legitimate healing for some people, or charlatan healing for many others, the appearance of healing. And so I think that's a really complex time period through which to analyze things. One of the things that is of note, and this is because I try to include him heavily in my Verdant Gnosis, so the papers we write for the VGS conference, mine focused on flowers and spiritism. And so I wanted to include a couple personalities who I would say are not necessarily overtly spiritist, but are so informed by spiritism that it would be folly to not include them, and Charabel's one of them. So I do think that because he made his living healing people and doing demonstrations, he didn't particularly care for the mundanity, the baseness of spiritism, and especially the embroiling with intrigue and charlatanry and implying false hope that was used to give people, ideas about the afterlife and things like that. But he was interested in a way in forging forward new things, because yes, herbs have always contained medicine, but we also have during the 19th century an increasing reliance on it, especially in America, but all over the world, of pharmaceutical medicine, and a departure from the cure yourself through herbs crowd. He was not interested in publishing what was already done. There's a quote that there are, however, cheap books on the market devoted to descriptive botany, and elsewhere he talks about medical botany in that way. I consider it needless. I should waste time and occupy space on such a line when the same might be purchased at a bookstall. I shall confine myself to what cannot be purchased otherwise than by reading my revelations. So he wrote a book that he didn't want to waste 22 extra pages in the book with drawings of plants. If he gave the Latin name and a folk name or three, that was sufficient. Right. He wanted to get down what he needed to get down. The fact that he calls it the psychology of botany, also the nascence of psychology as a term, by 1906, so late 1800s, early 1900s when he's writing. But what he does is a departure from spiritism, in that spiritism in its popular form does not allow for anything other than humans to have souls. And so when you start importing concepts of animism into your work, it's not at odds with spiritism, but it is not inherently spiritist. Yeah. And so by the modern era, like, you would be remiss to go, like, if you go to Lilydale in New York, you're going to see a lot of spiritism dedicated to dead pets, but not necessarily the dead rose bush that, died in your parents' house that you have fond memories of. And so plants are usually excluded from this kind of spirit construct that was very popular, that spiritism's popularity arises out of the fact that it wasn't that heretical. It just it democratized access to the spirit world and to the dead in a way during a time period when there was massive death and increasing globalization. Anyway, what he does, and I think we've talked about this a little bit before, but what he does, if anybody's familiar with Schulke's Verdarium Umbris, there is this concept of like the staves and these sigils that are made with invocations towards certain plants, towards certain purposes. And Schulke writes these poems and gives like often divine names for certain plants. I do not believe there's a way that he could have done this without reading Charabel. And it's weird because Schulke usually cites his sources in a bibliography in that way. I don't know if it was an oversight or what. I'm not condemning him for that. I think Verdarium Umbris is one of the most beautiful traditional witchcraft books in the modern era. It helps define the genre over and over, as Schulke often does. But Charabel has these sigils and calls them as such, or at least by the time it's published in 1906, where like for lichen, there is a sigil of lichen, and we did this a couple episodes ago with a specific plant. But an invocation word. So the invocation word for lichen is Bathrael. So it's following a kind of angelic language of ending in L. But there's sometimes longer invocations of poetry, but the idea is that you can work with these plants without even the physical plant being present. That the sigil embodies the animistic soul of the plant. So, like the sigil of moss, which kind of looks like the way that women are drawn on restroom signs, and its name is Arutel. He says, fix your eyes on the sigil. If you can realize the moss itself as well, do so. Look on the sigil or on the moss, the living moss, not a bit plucked up or detached from its place, for a few minutes before speaking the word. Then utter the word distinctly and sacredly 7 times. Allow a minute between each word. He's doing this so that you can start to understand that the plant has an agency and that you could then use this moss for him, like the infirmities quote, for which moss psychologically is an antidote, are vagaries, falseness, delusive visions, hallucinations of every kind, despondency, melancholy of every cast, and suicidal proclivities. So that by meditating on the sigil of the plant, you invoke the plant. You could have the living plant there as well, but that gazing on the sigil and then saying the word in this manner was enough to access the spirit of the plant and begin a healing on the person calling upon it.
Yeah.
So this is a liber spiritum, but with 25 plants and a few minerals in there. That I know people that have tried to continue his work, and there's kind of an underground community that trades continues to trade in Charubel-esque sigils and names and things like this. He doesn't have necessarily all of the plants that you would expect. It's an interesting mixture of what he has. As far as the index of plants, he goes through where's plants? Adder's tongue, ash tree, anemone, alder, brookline, buttercup, birch, box tree, celandine, clematis, Christmas rose, crimson poppy, cranesbill, devil's bit, elder tree, elm tree, ferns, fig tree, holly tree, heather, ivy, lichen, lilac, lime, mosses, mare's tail, monkshood, mallow, mountain ash, oak tree, orange, peony, poppy family, poplar tree, St. John's wort, wood sorrel, and yew. It's a beautiful list, but it is not by any means exhaustive. Although he will then, there's an index by which you can look up diseases and ailments in this same book, which I'm sure the editor did. But that, like for lust, that elder tree is a plant that you can go to. For mental anxiety, birch tree or box tree. This has notes to it that remind me of who I also talk about in the article of Bach flower remedies, where he's placing a petal on his tongue and kind of getting impressions of the changes to his personality and outlook based upon an intimate experience, a Gnostic revelation, if you will, based on the purity of the plant experience, and therefore putting those petals in spring water with the rays of the sun capturing into the water, and then diluting that with a little bit of alcohol, and through a homeopathic dilution, Bach flower remedies are born. So I appreciate Charbel in many ways. One, for his audacity of I'm not doing shit anybody's done before. That the insertion of animism, without calling it as such, there speaks to a relationship with plants that is rare at the time. It is not just go forth and multiply and dominate the garden back, in order to achieve the garden again.
Yeah.
But he is genuinely wanting people to be able to heal themselves using the plants around them through conversation and relationality. That it is no longer just how do you use that plant, but what can that plant with me affect? What effect can we have on each other? How do we heal using the assistance of this plant? Is a very different thing. He was already ill by the late 1890s. The last 15 years of his life was not fun. Like many spiritualists of the time, as World War I climate starts happening more and more in that time, it's harder to make a living off of being a healer because he wasn't taking a lot of money to begin with, the ethical ones. And so he was often couch hopping and visited by people who would come to find him in his own house. And they traveled all over the world to get his opinion and study with him. But he died in 1908 in Manchester with no real money to his name and a stack of manuscripts he left to Robert Welch. He's someone, because I've read Grimoire Sympathia so many times, of just referencing and in awe of how he thinks for someone of, a humble Welshman of the late 1800s. Of like, I think Grimoire Sympathia is a wonderful thing for anybody to get a copy of. It is incredibly hard to get a hard copy of. You can find a pirated version of the PDF readily available online. I'm not supporting piracy, but maybe someone can republish it sometime, and then I could have an alternative. Um, but for now, I like that there's stones as well, like red garnet, gold, obviously, are in there. I mean, there's sapphire and things like that are in there, especially the breastplate jewels are often in there. But I love this idea, extremely allyship. It before the kind of infiltration of New Ageism, where vegetalismo and things like this had to make their way for certain schools of thought about plants to be popular. You had Charabel proposing that you could commune with the plant, learn what it could do, and then through dialogue and dedicated relationship, call upon the non-physical plant to then enact physical cures.
Yeah. I think you put it beautifully about like you're not just harvesting and using the virtues of botanicals or minerals. Like, yeah, I found a quote going through it where he's kind of describing the process. He says there is an influence emanating from each plant or tree, and that when a person thinks intently on any of these, he or she brings himself or herself in sympathy with that plant or tree. I think that really expresses like you're not just using the sympathies of the plant, you are in sympathy with it.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that, like, this is the notions of allyship that we get from a Castaneda type New Ageism that infiltrates by the 50s, 60s, 70s. That this is something that's previous to that. I don't know his sources other than this. I truly believe that this is whole cloth for him. That he's out in his garden and talking to, the devas as they are, such that he knows them. That when you get to Emerald and he does that's where we did it before. The invocation of Ambra thou mother and father, one divine, thou source of all power, with thy beauty combined. Like, first off, rhyming, he gets points for that on a Wiccan scale. But his tone is really quite different and lovely to play with. His obsession with diamond is coming from a realm of light where darkness had never been known. From thence it fell to this earth by the breath of strange winds it was blown. It's not the best poetry. It's a little bit like he was trying to write a grimoire in the 1990s and it was going to get published by the publishing company that starts with an L. But there's a lot in there, and I really think it's worth a read. It's worth it as an inspiration. It's worth it to call upon him as an inspiration, in my opinion. And there's I have 3 people I know that I consider very close friends, all in the UK actually, who work in the spirit of Charabel, and they go for walks with Charabel. So it's like carry it with you in your pocket and go for a walk and see what he says about various plants. And he's still giving. The wonderful thing about spiritism, right? Like, your teacher dies, you can, or you have a teacher you never met, you can still call on them, and the necromancy for the win. And what are spirits except necromancers in petticoats usually. So yeah, that's Charabel, and I think there's something about doing him in this time period with the height of the year, when we're seeing, well, this isn't the hottest time of the year, but the sun at its peak, plants are in full bloom, it is the greening, it is the great greening right now, and something about the opportunity to make sure that I remind myself about Charabel at this time, who I genuinely have a love for, to remind myself to not pass up each greening each year as like, I know what this plant is doing, but to really see what that plant is doing if possible, and how it's growing. And the pattern, one of the greatest things about moving here to the Catskills and seeing the patterns of the year of which plants follow which on my property or neighboring properties, or when you go for a walk in the mountains, of like which trees bloom after other trees. and the relationality between things. That if this plant isn't doing well, then this other plant doesn't seem to be doing well either. And I feel like this is the gift of trying to think like um, Thomas, trying to think like Charbel, and just constant information from the world around you to the point where it does not always need to be photographing a plant and guessing looking up what it does. It can be talking to the plant, seeing it growing alive, which is a common restriction in many herbalism traditions, that you cannot use a plant unless you've seen it growing, breathing the same space, maybe even barefoot in the earth with the mycelium network, on your side. But anyway, yay, Charbel.
Yeah, yeah. And the sigils also aren't that complicated. They don't mean that you need the book necessarily. I mean, great reference, great thing to carry, great locus for his spirit to follow you. But like, they're not super fiddly with a million different crosses, and they're very simple shapes very often.
Yes.
Something you can do with
gives way to the modified version that Schulke is doing, where he talks about staves that you gather from a patron tree. So you have various lengths of like 3, 4, 5, 6 inch staves that you carry in a bag, and that when you need to access certain things, that you would draw the stave in your patron tree's way. So his sigils tend to be a little bit more, and he calls them cross seals specifically. But there's like, for instance, the cross seal of the unknown host for supplication and petition unto the spirits of the pleasure garden. So this is in, the Verum Empress is broken up by short chapters that are on a specific subject. So the book of the unknown host, the pleasure garden of shadow. But the invocation that goes with this, and this particular one, the unknown host, is a quartered, it's a cross that's then got crosses on the terminus of each part of the cross, and then there is a diamond that would be like a solar cross where you have the circle like a Celtic cross, but it's now a diamond that is in the center of just below the edges of the 4 outer crosses. And it's powers of the cross of the host unknown by shade light of Rosa, the tree of mystery. So he's invoking Rose. I bow before the guarded gates. Go forth in flesh as the sacred heart of the Rosarium. By 7 and 30 knots let the hidden path shine. Ambar Daru Nalumba Sharuha. Amen. He uses Latin names and variations on folk names as words of power to invoke that plant towards a specific end. And so I think that Schulke was definitely inspired by Charubel, and then took it one step further through his own praxis and gnosis in that way. So that, this same type of thing that if you go a little bit further, the cross seal of Elfame for making offering, prayer, and peace unto the good folk, you would take your staves and make this sigil on the ground, and then the invocation, powers of the cross of Elfame by light of thorn, tree of dominion of fairy, I praise the hollow hill, go forth in flesh as the door into the kingdom of mist, Sagina stellaria batonia onantha, amen. So it's a very similar process built upon and on Charabel for sure, but also slightly different. And your note of the sigil being simple is, I think, very important, because he's also saying, make these out of sticks so that you can actually do this work in nature. This is not meant to be a carpet tradition. It is meant to make you go on pilgrimage, which in tradcraft, as I know it, the concept of pilgrimage is so important, that you visit sacred sites, you visit certain trees, you visit the landscape as it starts to change through the seasons, you visit the mighty dead, known and unknown, in their graves, known and unknown. The saints' days of reverence are when the ice defrosts the most, or local saint churches being praised as like, well, let's see what they do and what festivals are around there, and what does your town have, what are its main crops that it celebrates every year, and that type of thing. All of which is trying to reintegrate your witchcraft back into the land, as opposed to impose. And this is where, we'll go off and we'll always get criticized. Like, I like Murray, but the imposition that there is a one way of doing things upon all cultures of Europe that sort of have some hint of witchcraft is preposterous, and also lets out this, like, what about other cultural expressions outside of Western Europe that are doing similar things by merely looking at the land and interacting with the land. And it doesn't have to be pastoral nostalgia. It can actually be fucking interaction with the world around you, where you are not isolating yourself from the world, but actually becoming part of it.
Yeah. Putting yourself at the crossroads that, like, spark further that spark further sparks of inspiration, of conspiration, of conspiring with these spirits and their influences and working with their sympathies. Yeah, absolutely.
I like the cognates. Yeah. Spark further spark. So that was good. And yeah, that's good. I like that. It appears after my rant, unless you have anything. Did you want to say anything about Charabel?
I love hearing you talk about Charabel. I encountered the grimoire like when I was looking for other grimoires, and in my I think late teens, maybe early 20s, and didn't give it enough credit. I was looking for demons, and I was like, this is plants. This is. I mean, he does have. Yeah, rude. How dare you? Yeah, I'm grateful. I can look at younger Al and be like, oh, that's cute. You'll get there. Charabel does at least for the mountain ash, not just offer. He says the sigil. He goes off on one about the nymph of mountain ash and about nymphs in general. So there is some like full-on animism and spirit work in there as well. If this wasn't spirit work enough. So again, Pastel was wrong about a bunch of stuff. Bless him. But no, I think it's great to shine a little more light on him and to show as you have that these are opportunities to continue the work and to use it not just as a bibli to make our world narrower, but to expand all the things that can be done with some very simple but very effective circles drawn around things.
It's interesting. You get this comment notes like cheating, right? He wrote under the name of Julius Balsamo, a reference to Cagliostro during his lifetime, and Charabel is the astrological name that it's just I guess it's prettier, so we like that. He fell ill 1890, 1891. Still had a good reputation as a spiritist and a medium, like not a fraud, and therefore that meant he was what? Poor. He, quote, he has come entirely to grief and is sending begging letters to everyone. He was a medium in communication with the color spirits with which he seems to have had a pact, but on 2 occasions he nearly lost his life through them. The most apparently peaceable elementals, if a storm happens to come on, will become very violent and uncontrollable. The conflict of the elements seems to excite them to fury, and woe to the mortal not being an adept who encounters them. Thomas has gone the way of all mediums. I have investigated the circumstances as to a good many, and I find they all go wrong sooner or later. And unquote. And that's it's such an interesting thing to be like, here's someone who's in touch with things, who's channeling good information, trying to do good in the world, but he doesn't know how to turn it off to the point where he can live a healthy life. And this is the great spirit sickness that happens for the last 15 years of just penniless misery. And it's certainly, in my opinion, I will assert that I don't think it's because Brooklime and Mountain Ash and Emerald are talking to him. But
be careful of those storms, though.
Yeah, I could be wrong. So I'm just saying, if your life goes to shit after calling upon Heather through his sigils, it's your own damn fault. Because you're most likely working with pirated text and it's all a curse. I'm kidding. I think. Maybe that's why I like, Anyway, so with that, I think we've hit all our we've whack-a-moled everything out.
I think so.
Maybe a little bit less connection. No, there was plenty of connection. There was a lot of mercury flowing through there.
There was. Yeah. Well, we gave ourselves a Solve and a coagula in terms of Carker in the world, and also Gnosis and Mercury and Hazel. Yeah.
Is all sulfur brimstone? No, but it's all brimstone sulfur. Yes. Thus say the Satanists. Okay, so on that, I suppose I would like to wish you, Al, and dear listener, a happy Saint Irenaeus Day. And to the trinity of demons who we seem to know nothing about, except their corresponding Exus, huzzah, keep it up, keep up the good work. I like the mystery. It's the question that drives us, and there is no spoon. Hazel-wise, if Hazel's going to be a witch, let her be a witch. And if she's going to lead you to water, don't let her drown you. Be wise to her games. Charbel, I love you. Yeah. World, Karker, Mercury, all of the above. And I love you, Al. I hope you have a really good end of June, and we'll be on this game again soon. I turn over the poetry sponge mic to you.
Oh, thank you, Jesse. I love you too, and I love to do this with you, and I love getting to chat to people who listen to it and tell us new things about things, whether that's more information about our shadowy three. It's fun to think about not just using European spirits to try and explain away or even explore Exus of Quimbanda, but the potential existing for those practitioners who've met them through their counterparts to reach out. That would be cool. Thanks everyone. Great to do these as always. I hope that all of your personal experiences of the divine, fire you with a renewed sense of the spark of that divine. I hope all you turn as many half-remembered conspiracy theories into awesome rejections of control mechanisms. I hope all your secrets are useful to keep. I hope Karka gives you renewed focus and discipline, and that you don't leave the lights off too long. And I hope your world gets to have some lovely heresy all of your own, as well as some rejections of other people's that don't work for you.
Yours was much better than mine. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Happy Saint Irenaeus. Happy Golgothizing, and we'll catch you on the next one. And thank you, Al.
Thank you, Jesse. Thanks, everyone. Catch you soon.
Bye.